already recording. Sure. Let me just introduce myself first. Thank you all for being here. And my name is Arnaldo Ferreira. I'm a geneticist with the Forest Service in California. And this is part of, the many projects we have going on in the region. And this is one of them, the ones that we need to have the most, assistance, help with, right? Over the years, let's say the Forest Service have not been that attentive to seed collections because, understaffed and many other reasons, lack of funding and so on. But lately, we have been getting, a lot of, let's say, incentive to ramp up our cone collections, our seed collections. We have this, just to give a quick background, we do have a seed bank, regional seed bank in Placerville with our nursery. And this seed bank pretty much is what we provide seeds for, all of our federal lands in California. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of gaps in the seed bank because we divide them in seed zones and elevation bands for the many species that we use as pioneer species, right? And this effort that we're trying to put together over the years of getting to have more contractors, more people from other agencies involved in cone collections, it's something that we believe is going to help us fill in those gaps, not just for our own seed bank, but also, for Cal Fire Seed Bank. And I don't know if there's any other private, maybe seed banks around. Please interrupt me at any time if you have any questions. I'd rather, to answer fresh as I go over things. We decided starting with this step because it's the planning step, right? We are going to evaluate what we have, what we need in terms of seeds to reforest, and that's an exercise. It requires, a lot of GIS work, information from the ground, people that have been with the Forest Service for decades, have contributed to these plans, and it is, fluent. It's something that we always adjusting because, we have larger incidents that we gotta make sure we have seeds for. Oh, that's it. This one? Oh, my computer. It's your computer. So a quick introduction here is normally we see cycles in cone crops varying from 2 to 10 years depending on the species, right? There's a lot of genetic variation, and the locations where you find them also will play a role in how often we'll see a cone crop. The other thing that I'd like to emphasize is that our seed bank, we try to plan it for a 10-year time period. So we are being proactive here. We are trying to have enough seeds to at least attend or supply the demand that we'll have from projections for a 10-year period. Like I mentioned, we have a seed bank managed by the Forest Service in Placerville. And this seed bank is pretty much divided the seed lots into seed zones and elevation bands for each species. We do have also seed strategy for transfer guidelines. And with the changing climate, we need to do that, right? So this is a little bit more complex, but I'm going to give you a general idea of how we recommend seeds nowadays, because we do have gaps. And a lot of times, we do need to fulfill some orders in areas where we don't have seeds for. Therefore, we got to rely on these transfer guidelines. I'm going to just go more over the illustration part of it. It's easier for me to explain. Normally, I make those slides as kind of like a referral people can go back to and go over it. But here it is, the seed zones in California. Most of the seed zones are sitting, in federal lands. We do have seed zones for areas where we do not have forests, but that's not something we are that concerned here. For example, the El Dorado National Forest is sitting in one seed zone, right? But we have forests like the Klamath National Forest, which is sitting more than one seed zone, and things get a little bit more complex when you're trying to plan. In terms of measuring, these seed zones were based on adaptive climatic conditions back then. There were several. The last update on a seed zone, I think, was 1974. So they are due. And actually, CAL FIRE has been collaborating with UC Davis in a project to update the California seed zones. And they have developed a tool that help, you coordinate, for example, seed transfers using it. In the Forest Service, over the past 40 years or so, we have established progeny sites for different species. Throughout California, we have this network that I'm going to show you in a little bit, that we have tested several families to make sure that they are well adapted, they can adapt in certain conditions. Back then, the intention was to select the best families to put into seed orchards. And we do have the seed orchards in Forest Hill, Chico. Our main seed orchards is a place where you can just pretty much stop and collect seeds that can be used for more than one seed zone, for example. These field trials allowed us to determine like the variation, genetic variation, the genetic adaptation due to this variation for different species like ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and sugar pine. And doing so, we are able to create something else beyond seed zones that we call breeding zones, right? It can cover more than one seed zone. It means that those seeds from seed orchards, they have breeding zones attached to them. They are more plastic, more adapted, because they were selected based on this network of field trials. And the way we select them is like, hey, which ones are the progenies that can adapt in several environments well? They're not going to be maladapted, can grow very well. And those are called, so we're selecting based on a G by E, we call genetic by environmental interaction. And these field trials help us determine these transfer guidelines. Here's the network of field trials we have in California. As you can see, throughout the Sierra Nevada all the way to the northern forests. And they are mainly for ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, which is our, bread and butter. Bread and butter species. We do have a smaller network of field trials for sugar pine, but sugar pine, the main objective is for disease resistance, for blister rust resistance. We do have some white fir as well. And we have some provenance tests, for example, for giant sequoia in a couple locations. This next slide shows you how a breeding zone is. It's not similar to a seed zone. It's more complex because you're taking consideration also elevation. And in order to recommend that, we have matrices and maps to help. And normally a forester, it'll be complicated for them to figure it out which breeding zone to use. If it, you gotta talk to us and we can help determining that. But again, breeding zones are used mostly for seed orchard material. This is not wild stand collection. In order to have a breeding zone tagged to a seed lot, you need to have a progeny testing network behind it. So this is the requirement for you to determine where those breeding zones are and how much of an area it will cover for a specific species. And as you see here, you have Ooh, can I walk away from the phone, right? I'm not used to talking like sitting down. I feel awkward, but I need to because of the microphone. But essentially, you see the SP means sugar pine, PP means ponderosa pine, and BZ is breeding zone. And you have breeding zone 3, lower elevation, high, and so on. Here's another illustration about our breeding zones and the forest that it covers and how that tags into our seed orchard map. Right, in the seed orchard, in this case is for Chico seed orchard, we have the ponderosa pine breeding zones and the Douglas fir breeding zones. We also have another tool that I like to mention, and I believe this is open outside the Forest Service as well. We call the Forest Service Reforestation Toolbox. You can find a lot of, guidelines and instructions there for seed transfers, seed collections, how to estimate cone crop for a specific year. It is a good, valuable resource, additional resource that you would have. And I believe this presentation is going to be available for you to download and, and look at those resources. Now, after this brief introduction about seed zones, breeding zones, seed orchards, our network of field trials, and so on, here it is how we start our seed needs plan. In general, for California, we have about over 20 million acres of national forest lands, right? From all that land, about 7 million are shrubs and non-forest areas. But the bottom line is we have about 13 million acres of forest lands. From all these forest lands in California, federal, we have about 8.4 million that what we call plantable land base. These are areas that we can do something about it. They're productive enough, and the rest of them will be very difficult to get to and maybe not effective in replanting after fires. So there's plenty areas for us to work with, and this estimates does not include BLM, the park services. Okay. In terms of forest type composition, the major forest types, you see them. A good part of it is Douglas fir forest. It doesn't mean that it's just Douglas fir there. It's just the major forest type. There's other associated species that I will be mentioning a little bit. But west side mixed conifer, about 2 million acres. And of course, we have other ones like east side that about 1.3. And this is how that's kind of like a bigger picture of what our forest types are in California. We use this to determine, what species we will be planting in these areas, right? I'll go over it in a second. This is just some illustrations, that our major drive for planting is planting to restore after fires. Also, we got to consider disease, insect and drought as part of the whole picture of how we end up having forests that we need to plant. Now, the cone collection planning, it's essentially determining the amounts of seeds that we need to have in our seed bank. And there are several stages to it. The first stage is, what is the amount of seeds we need to have there that can cover within a 10-year period, all possible events that we have in California. And this is hard to predict. And as you probably notice, and I like to mention this, in 2020, the total deforested areas in California for federal lands was equivalent to the previous 11 years, right? So in 1 year, that's how much it was burned. We used to have what we call a backlog of about 400-ish thousand acres of areas that we could replant still before 2020. With the fires in 2020, that increased to about 1 million. Was almost 600,000 acres increased in that, let's say, to-do list. 2021, things were not any better. And I believe it increased roughly about 400 to 500,000 acres. So from what we have before 2020 as a 450,000 acres to something that we have now that's roughly between 1.4 to 1.5 million acres, it is a big deal. So we did not anticipate that in terms of collecting seeds and maintaining them stored in our seed banks. That's why we need to ramp it up. And that's why we have more resources nowadays to do so. I believe we have the money and the support. We need to have the people trained to do so. Again, just to pitch why we need to have these trainings more often, right? To get more contractors and collaborators around to help us now ramp up our seed bank to the current demands. So this seed plan, I would say I was pretty comfortable with in the past 11 years with the level of, let's say, adjustments we need to make to it. But now the adjustments are way larger than before. And it's something that I'm doing every year with the forest. Again, we designed these plans per species, seed zones and elevation bands. I always like to repeat that. And here it is. The first step of it, we set the priorities we call the seed needs. So we have all this plantable land base that I just illustrated a little bit ago. And we go over and take a look at fire severities, the frequencies, again, the major forest types, and the seed zones, elevation bands, and the seedling demand. So that's the first step, determining. And I'm going to go over in a little bit of the procedural part of it. The second step is something that we do every year, or every year that a forest would like to allocate for collections. And we get this seed needs assessment, which means, okay, this is the total amount of seeds that we need in the seed bank for these different species here, for these seed zones and elevation bands. And then we go over the seed inventory, whatever we have at the moment, right? And normally our seed inventories are updated like around March, because they got to reflect the collections from last year, the seeds that were processed, and also the sowing orders, that the withdrawal seeds that we had, right? So we normally do these plans after March because we have the updated seed inventory. And also we take in consideration the recent fires. If there is any immediate, location that we need to pay more attention for the next corn crop season. Bumper crops, cycles, some things that we have an idea for some locations, but it varies so much. But depending on the location, for example, in a specific forest, if that forest is involved every year, they already have an idea about when these bumper crops might come around, right? So that's local knowledge. And again, we're starting with field surveys. We have kind of done it so far a little bit, but it intensifies as during this month and next month. And we need this feedback from the field surveys to figure out what the priority areas for collections will be. Available resources, and has to do with funding, has to do with contracts in place, has to do with people available for survey, contractors available for collections. Elevation bands is one of the components for the seed planning and seed zones. The next step, we take a look at the major forest types in California. And then the species compositions for those forest types in specific locations, because they would change. And this is mostly a GIS exercise. And then we create these massive tables. And I need to step away a little bit just to illustrate this. You may not be able to see from there, unfortunately, but here's the seed zones, are the seed zones, and here's the major forest types, and here's the amount of acreage that we consider plantable land base. And here are all the elevation bands that we have within that seed zone, forest type, and the number of acres we have. Well, historically, we have some information about what forests used to plant in a specific elevation, right? For that forest type, let's say they're planting 180 trees per acre. With that information, we're going to figure out also what are the major species that you like to plant in that location. We come up with recommendations, right? Based on historical information. We bring that to the forest and we discuss. Is that right? Are you still willing to plant at that forest type, at this elevation band, 100 trees per acre? They say it's not anymore. We are going 200 or you're going 100. So we change it. Okay, what are the species that we're focusing to plant at that elevation? Mostly or all of it's going to be coulter pine. Coulter pine it is. But as we start going to other elevations, we start changing the species mix. So we do provide some information what historically used to be, but we like to have the local feedback, what is feasible, right? And again, I like to emphasize this to several people that we are not trying to put all species back. You know, we'd like to, but we don't have the resources for that. So what we're trying to do is introduce conifer species that will speed up the process of restoration, right? It is way better than not doing anything. And I have many pictures and illustrations to show that, right? Introducing some with this changing climate, you're gonna avoid, some succession with shrubs and other even invasive species around. So again, attentive to the fact that we're trying to focus on the major species to speed up the process of restoration. And we get the feedback from the local forest every time we're trying to design. This design here is once in a while, it's not every year, right? We are just trying to determine what is the cap, the seed needs that we need. And from this information, we can calculate now what are the total number of seeds we need to go after, or we need to maintain our seed bank. So with that information about the seed needs, and again, with the input, GIS exercises, using all the layers I mentioned, and with the feedback from the forest about what they would plant, the species that we used, we now have that total amount of seeds in this matrix of seed zones, elevation bands per species. Once we have that, we go to the cone collection priorities. Cone collection priorities, we use kind of similar matrix where we have the species in the columns, and we have the elevation, the seed zones and elevation bands, and we start highlighting what are the bushels that would need for a particular species that need to be harvested. Everything that's red, it means 2 bushels, 3. Some areas that are not highlighted means, well, we don't need to prioritize that elevation band in that seed zone because we do have surplus from the elevation right below it. And we do this kind of like every year, whenever is necessary, prioritizing, selecting the areas that we need to pay more attention to. And we generate this report, and I can provide a sample report for you all to see. There's several pages, but the first page is showing a map of the forest, the national forest. Do you think there's still? Okay, I'm getting the microphone closer. That's kind of odd, but look like a Pokemon ball. But anyway, so here's the report showing a map of the forest with the seed zones, and I give them some summaries. And again, I apologize that you cannot see from there, but here are the seed zones, and here tells the percentage of that seed zone sitting in that forest. And the reason why I do that is because a lot of times I'll tell them, hey, if you don't collect from this seed zone, nobody else, no other forest will, right? so that you have no backup. You really got to go there and make sure that 100% of seed zone 522 is sitting on you, that you're going to do something about it. The other part that I provide a little brief is all that exercise of figuring out the priorities and how much. I give a table showing how many bushels you would need for, let's say, incense cedar for those locations. The other part that I provide is kind of like a assistant little table that they can just cut it out and leave in a truck. And as the people driving around, if they stumble upon, like, let's say, seeing a crop for a ponderosa pine, they can just come here and take a look and say, oh yeah, we need seeds from this elevation. We have better ways to do it now. And I think Wade is going to go over the survey app that make lives a lot easier. But this is just to give a, let's say, a summary of what is the high priority for collections per species, seed zone, and which elevation ranges we need to be paying attention for survey. Is to help during this next 2 months process we have right now. Okay, so before I get to seed sources and climate change, do you have any questions? Not that I know of. I mean, we do have reports, right? I would say like this, CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, because we do have the major seed banks in California, we have this historical archive, of, for example, different species, what was collected in given years in given locations. We are trying to use that information right now. I don't know in what stage CAL FIRE is, but we are still, the Forest Service, we're still trying to compile that information to have that cyclic idea per species and regions and areas of how the cone crop was in a given year. But their references, in my point of view, they're kind of vague. They would say like, oh, a sugar pine have a cycle of about 3 years, for a bumper crop. Big cone Douglas fir, maybe 4 or 5 years. But what I have noticed, it depends a lot of the location. I have been in places where big cone Douglas fir have yielded good cone crops, every 3 years. It varies. But having this historical data will help us have a feeling, of, let's say, cycling of good potential cone crop for different species. Oh, I see. Right. So I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I thought that you're more concerned about, when you're talking about amounts of seeds, I was thinking more about related with a given cone crop year. But in terms of, yeah, I can share that with you. Actually, I'll share that with the group, not just this presentation, but a summary of our seed plans, which has that information in there. You have, for example, for ponderosa pine, how many seeds per pound you should be expecting, for example, for a forest, which I have done that, and for the entire region, just to have a ballpark idea. Then, for example, how many bushels, pounds you would get from a bushel of cones. So all that information about size of seeds and amounts, I do have in a table that can help, for planning purposes. But again, it's variation. This is based on, let's say, historically what we'll be getting at the seed or I mean in our seed bank. When you deal, for example, with seed orchard seeds, things change a little bit because you know that they're being cultivated, right? So fertilized, watered, and so on. So numbers can change. But for wild stands, they do have variations as well. But I always give, like, say, for a local forest, what is the average number of seed counts you have per pound, or and also give a ballpark idea for the entire region for California. Any other questions about seed planning, cone collection plans? I don't want to speak for Cal Fire, but I know that they're working on their cone collection plans, right? And then I can talk more about that. I I believe we need to have some sort of procedure in place that others can follow to develop their own seed plans and cone collection priorities. I'll try to work on that after this season, kind of like templates and so. Please hit me with any questions. I'll see if I can answer them.
I know you mentioned that like this would be happening in the next 2 months. Is that only a certain time period each year when you collect cones?
In January, yeah, but you gotta remember we have, for example, serotinous species like, for example, coulter pine. I have heard people collecting coulter pine as early as May. But when you go to collect species like coulter pine, you gotta have a very good idea, what you want to. For example, coulter pine, if you see the cones a little greenish, it means now you gotta wait until September to collect them. And you can probably collect them all the way to May the following year. So what you see people sometimes collecting off season are cones that are already mature, they just haven't opened up yet. Cypress species the same way. But the bulk of the collections we are talking about here will happen, I would say, mid-August to the end of September. So it's a very narrow window. Sometimes higher elevation species you can push a little longer, getting to maybe first week of October. But you never know because you could have heat waves and other factors affecting, the maturation opening of those seeds. Also, when you're dealing with species that are high elevation and let's say hard access, we normally have this procedure that will cage them. And cage is this kind of like metal meshes, like aluminum type, soft, that we put around the branches. And at least we don't need to be there at the exact moment for maturation, and also, like loose in case they open up earlier. But we don't do that for general cone collections. This is for specialty collections for high elevation pines, endangered species like bristlecone pine, limber pine, white bark pine. The rest of them, normally caging is not required.
Thank you.
But they all happen once cone collection season starts in Southern California, it doesn't end. It's just boom, boom, boom. You just got to be fast. And that's why I tell contractors, my experience with contractors is this: ideal crew, 4, right? They can fit in the truck. You have 2 climbers, and you have a ground person and a coordinator around. And that's an ideal crew. A crew like that, effective crew, let's say trained, I would say they can do about 25 bushels a day without any problem, with the give and take movement between sites to collect. This is kind of like a ballpark. They normally used to tell me, okay, 25 bushels, is less than that, less than 20 bushels, they're already running on the red. Not sure. This is what I have heard. So whenever you're planning, now we're going to be doing surveys, figuring out what the cone crops are, contrasting that map or where the cone crops are with our needs to prioritize, right? Because we have limited funding. The next step is figure out how we can be efficient in giving the contractors, a route for them to work. Because I have had occasions where we didn't check the cone crop close to cone collection season, and we end up having, cones aborted, like sugar pine last year and big cone Douglas fir. And sometimes we'll take the whole day with the contractor reaching a certain site and they don't have anything to collect. And that's, horrible for them. And that's why we need to be more um, true with planning and checking. And what I mean is, once we figure out where the cone crops are, that we need to prioritize, figure out their route. And before it, ideally, we got to check to make sure there is no abortion and they can still carry on the collections. This way, they can keep up, let's say, the minimum amount of bushels that they need to collect to be profitable. Otherwise, they will disappear. And I have seen many contractors disappearing because it was so variable. Sometimes they can make, a good profit. Sometimes they wouldn't. And we do need more contractors in California. I just want to plug that in.
Finding that some of these are break.
I noticed I never experienced a problem with abortion until last year. My personal experience from what, 11 years. That was the first time. And so it had to do with drought, most likely, maybe other factors. In terms of maturation, in Southern California, let's say the southmost forest we have in the Cleveland, I have noticed that maybe a week, second week of August might be okay to collect, for example, Jeffrey pine, but we still need a little more time for the white fir to mature. Believe it or not, there's white fir in Southern California, like in the extreme south. Sugar pine, incense cedar, it will take sometimes 3 weeks. So I have noticed some species maybe maturing maybe a little earlier, but it's variable because it has to do with heat wave too. And other species are, I don't know, they're just more resilient and they're maturing later, like they used, not later, but like they used to. So it is variable. The only thing that I have is anecdotal, observations about that. Any other questions?
Said earlier that prioritizing selecting species that will speed up the process of rest. I guess operate a little.
Yeah, so when we go through what we call major forest types, right, we have several, let's say, mapping, like cow veg is one of the main ones used. In that forest type, depending the location where you're talking about, let's say on the El Dorado National Forest, it will have a certain species composition, right? You have a major species that is dominant. Let's say at a lower elevation, the forest at lower elevation, let's say ponderosa pine. And then you're going to see associated species with that, besides hardwoods, other conifer species. So what we consider a major forest type, for planting is what we normally see in those classifications, right? Now, the composition is something that we can work with. In composition, we got to consider, for example, survival, right, of a species. So when you're planting, because some are more resilient than others. If you work with incense cedar, you notice that's more resilient than, let's say, sugar pine whenever you're planting, depending on the location, of course. But so the planting species composition is not necessarily what that ratio is not necessarily what you would be getting, 3 or 5 years later. So that's something people got to be considering too, right? Because you have survival, competition, other aspects involved with it. Um, I would say that when you have a specific project, we try to put in that area, we will, is the major species that normally used to be there. We're not trying to introduce new species to these areas. right? Whenever you talk about managed relocation, that's one of the practices that we're trying to do more because of climate change. We're trying to work with transferring different populations, neighboring populations of ponderosa pine. Maybe, for example, we'll get material from a lower elevation that we know is going to be more adapted to a future climate. So we move it up 500 feet in elevation or 1,000 feet in elevation. But we do have tools that help us make those decisions. And then comes the next step. Okay, you introduce that major forest, that major species for that forest type. What are the associated species that we have available in our seed bank that we can use to augment that diversity, right? So this is not something that I can give you a rule for because this is planning. It's you have a specific fire, specific location. There's a lot of planning behind it, which makes the seed planner's life a lot harder. But we got to account for this variation when you're determining what our cap in our seed bank should be for different species, elevation bands, and seed zones. Was I able to answer your question? Any other one? How much time do I have? 25 minutes. Not a lot of questions here. I'm just trying to see how much should I get into seed source and resilience to climate. I'll just briefly introduce to this portion of it because actually I want to go to what they call seed transfer guidelines, just to give you an idea why sometimes, even when we don't have a need for a specific, let's say cell, and when I call cell, I'm saying seed zone elevation band or species, sometimes we will collect there because we're anticipating that in the future we might have a need of that seed, right, to be introduced, like say 500 feet higher in elevation or 1,000 feet or adjacent seed zone. And we are trying to prioritize the use of material from our tree improvement program, and this is a legacy program. There were, like I said, over 40 years of effort in it, selecting trees, testing them in progeny sites. From those tests, we select the best to be in seed orchards. And now we have, let's say, this collection of superior trees that produce offspring, right, seeds, that have some level of plasticity for adaptation, right? And this plasticity, I'm translating them in breeding zones that I mentioned earlier, right? Is a broader adaptation range. So this was possible because of this tree improvement process, right? That was selection, testing, and seed orchard creation. So that's, I'm not going to get in details about phenotypic plasticity, but that's what we're counting with. Back then, tree improvement programs were mainly focused in amount of wood you would produce, how easier it would be for you to harvest wood from a tree because it would be straight, less branches, and so on. But trees that grow faster and are adapted to a range of climate conditions are beneficial to resilience. It creates resilience to a future climate, this variation that we might have ahead of us. So end up being our next best source, improved source. Another thing too is when you go to the seed orchards, you have trees, they are not necessarily neighboring trees selected. Was not trees that were neighboring when you select them in native stands. So you do have a more, let's say, a higher level of diversity, right? Because you're crossing material that are not necessarily half sibs or closely related, but they are within a seed zone. They were within, let's say, some elevation ranges. So it does create more diversity in that bulk of seeds, which helps whenever you're facing a variable future climate, uncertain in some ways. One of the tools that we use for this manage relocation seed transfer guidelines. It's called seed lot selection tool. And this tool you can just access online and play with it. The other two is called CAST. That's the one that Cal Fire developed with UC Davis. And so those are the two tools out there that you can use to figure out, hey, this is my planting site. Where should I be looking for seeds that will be adapted to a future climate at this location? And here is some illustration about species distribution within mean annual temperatures, mean annual precipitation, and so on. And these tools use that information to create what they call climate envelopes for different species, where you most likely will find a species, right, for a specific climate profile. And of course, this species is not just about climate too, but about competition. And that's when it comes a little bit, not a lot of the local knowledge. You have the shade tolerant species. We have the more drought resilient, the ones that are more adapted to fire, and the ones that are more resilient to tolerant to snow damage, for example. And that's what you got to get in consideration when you're planting for a future climate. Let's say right now, I'm telling people, hey, maybe you should plant at 500 feet, 1,000 feet higher in elevation from the seed source where you got it from. It's not quite like that, because you might put in some species in a site where you might have a lot of snow damage for the current climate. So you're going to have eventually low survival. So there are little things you got to take in consideration that a lot of times this local knowledge, right, the forester on the ground will be able to advise you.
It was in. Not basically out, I guess. Out. Stamp. So, I mean. Having.
The first thing I would do is pinpoint that site, right? And go to a tool like the CAST system or the seed lot selection tool. And I'll figure out, for example, what would it recommend as a seed source, right? And so it will show you a little map. And in that map, if you have local maps about what type of species you normally have there, right there is an indication of what you should be introducing that site from now on. So it could be 500 feet in elevation. It's just pretty much, hey, looking down the hill and say, oh, I have a little bit, I'm not saying your case, more coulter pine down there. So maybe I should be bringing a little bit more coulter pine into the mix here. Not everything, I'm saying into the mix, because we are also considering, we are thinking about future climate, but the species that still deal with the current climate, right? That's what I would do. And I'll show you really quick how you play with this tool. But yeah, you see that I don't give you a straight answer, but I'm trying to give you a tool.
Especially when fire comes through. Nothing growing out there, right? A completely different whiteboard or paper that will might not grow this. Wow.
Yeah, but if you experience that used to be in St. Cedar, they used to be do well, but now with the new plantings, they are not. So it's already an indication that something, bigger is taking place there. And so for you to have a hint what might be surviving there or better adapted there, look at these other sites using these climate equivalent tools, them telling you. And you have a good recommendation, I guess. Oh, okay, I'm gonna mimic this one because it seems like equivalent. Here's another illustration showing climate-based distribution for some species. As you see, the top part is elevation bands. I mean, the elevation and mean annual temperature, the range in which you find them. This is just a general idea for you to see that they do have, let's say, different niches. Here's another one that I found in publications. I should be putting the referral for the publication there. I'm sorry for that. I forgot on this one. Again, for elevation, and then you have minimum displacement of the species for the different ones. But when you deal with seed lot selection tool, you normally need to know where is your project area. There's two ways to use this tool. One is you have a seed lot and you want to know where can you plant that seed lot, where that seed lot will be better adapted to. So it can answer that. The other part of it will be, hey, I have this project area. Where should I be looking for seeds? So you can do the both ways. And of course, the seed lot climate. If you're dealing with a seed lot that you already have in a seed bank, that seeds were from trees that are adapted to what climate? Oh, let's say to 2010. They give you different ranges that you can use for planting site climate. You want to plant in a site, you want those trees to be adapted for a climate between 2011 to 2040. So those are a few things that you got to select. Your location, this climate, for the seeds you have or for the planting site you want. And then the transfer limits. The transfer limits are essentially, for example, in this case, I use mean annual temperature. At that location is showing that it's 11.9, that planting site location. And here we normally have you use the standard limits. Don't mess with that. They are pretty good about suggesting about 1.7 to 2 degrees Celsius as a transfer limit. And then they come up with this map showing the parts that are red are the parts where you should be going for collecting seeds. So here's your planting site. You should be collecting seeds first. I would recommend go closer, right? And see if you have cone crop there to use in that site. And I did some simulations and I noticed there was about 500 feet to 1,000 feet in elevation difference. So the program is actually telling me, go find the seed sources at that elevation lower, closer to where you are. But of course, if you're not finding it, you keep branching out and going a little further. But I would not suggest you go that far further because this tool is not taking consideration species diversity, right? I will use it within an area that you think is reasonable, maybe within a seed zone. Use a seed zone boundary as your limit for now. Because if you expand this map, you're going to see sometimes they're going to coastal areas for you to get seeds for the Sierra Nevada. So no, this is about climate equivalency. You got to be careful how you use it. And here's the other tool that's called, it's called Candidate Seed Source Based CAS system. And here's I'm not sure if this link is working. Sometimes they change the host site, but I'm sure Danny, you can come up with the new one, right? And so it's again, but in this case, this tool, somebody asked, what is the difference between the two tools? I say, well, seed lot selection tool, you have more flexibility in playing with the climate scenarios you want for the future. However, if you don't understand that really well, and you start going, let's say, out of the comfort zone, you might turn out to be very bizarre output, right? See what I mean? Seed lot selection tool, you need a little bit more knowledge. You need to know a little bit more about your species. Remember that I showed you, for example, within a species, what type of mean annual temperature is more comfortable with, mean annual precipitation and things like that. Because in a seed lot selection tool, you got to select what are your climate variables that are relevant for the species or for the project area you are interested in. CAST, it was designed to be less demanding and the amount of knowledge you need to have in order to make a decision. That's why I would say work with both and try to see if they kind of overlap their recommendations in case it's not a problem. Um, so in the CAS system, have the same thing. In this case, it would tell you for this planting site here, the best sites to collect my seeds will be in the green areas. So I would go to green areas close to where my planting site is first, right? Or I'll look at the seed bank and see if they have seeds there in these green areas closer to my planting site. And here's what we did this year for a couple forests where we did not have seeds for their project area, right? There was some gaps in the seed bank. So using these tools, we're able to say, hey, we can get some seeds from a specific elevation band in 521 seed zone and transfer it to a 340 seed zone, which in the past we wouldn't do. We have this non-scientific based approach that would say only move seed zones around. I mean, seeds from the seed zones around. And never go too far south, but go more north. No, now we have two tools that can help us determine what are the best equivalencies or help us with the seed transfer guideline.
Does it stand that specific seed zone at the same elevation?
Right, we use those climate equivalencies and using the right climate profiles. And what I'm saying is, for example, mean annual temperatures may be more relevant to a species than another. But the CAS tool is more forgiving in that sense because it does have inputted in it, let's say, some models from papers on ponderosa pine, for example, right? But essentially, that's what it is. I would say I can use a seed lot from 521. I didn't list the elevation band. Oh, I did. So seed lot 521, 2000 to 2000 to 2500 elevation band, right? And I'm planting at 25 to 35. And I could only do that because I use those tools to find those climate equivalencies. I mean, doing that mostly when I do not have seeds in a seed bank to fulfill a sowing order. But we should be doing that also to think about adaptation to future climates. To some extent. I know that there's a lot of questions about that, but yes, but the output for the CAS system, there's a table. And I think I do have the table here. No, I don't. But it creates a table which tells you, for example, a rank for how much loss in productivity you will have. If you, for example, here shows that in this case, I'll have a loss, a future decline in productivity of about 2.1%, compared to 12% if I use a seed from the same source. So I'm planting in that location a seed that was collected around that location. So it just gives you a ballpark saying, hey, you're going to have a better adaptation or less maladaptation if you use seeds from here than using its own seeds if you had it. That's what the tool is telling you. It's not how I used here, right? But it does create those tables that you can rank them. And I have another presentation, but I do not have time to show you how, like step by step, how I use each of those tools. But I can make them available and be open for questions. I'm sorry, this is, I know, right? I was waiting. I wanted to show you that so bad. It's just my end slide. But here it's like some tools that we are developing to help the forest make, appropriate decisions in seed transferring. Yes, finally. Any questions? Right? But feel free, you have, if you don't have, we're going to be providing our email accounts, emails. So please send me, any emails if you have any specific questions or if you need any material that can help you build your seed plan or understand more about these tools that we are using.
You do that again. Okay. I'm gonna see if my mouse works from over here real fast. See the lag. There we go. Perfect. So good morning, everybody. My name is Olivia Rowe. I'm the district silviculturist for the High Sierra Ranger District here on the Sierra National Forest. And I'm going to be talking to you about some of the next steps that we kind of go into. Arnaldo sort of presented how we plan and how we kind of choose which seed source, and we're going to kind of convey like this and sort of what makes sense gradually. And then real quick, a lot of what I'm saying is going to be sort of more specific to the federal side of things. And then this afternoon, Denya and Jessica will cover more of the CAL FIRE state side of things. And there's going to be a few areas where I will jump in and say, like, this only applies to the federal government, or this does not apply to the state. So just a quick disclaimer for you guys. I've been working for the Forest Service since 2010. I did my undergraduate at Cal Poly and my graduate school at University of Idaho. I've been a COR for a long time. I'm a COR2 now. And with that, one of the things that I've done for the region, and actually Arnaldo got me kind of involved in this, is over the past few years, I've done a lot of the cone contracting for Region 5 for the Forest Service. And that was because we had a lot of forests that didn't have the capacity. We have a capacity issue with the Forest Service. I'm sure everyone's heard it here. And so we built some contracts that instead of just covering one district, we expanded it to cover, the whole forest, and then neighboring forest, and then neighboring forest, and then multiple years. And so we just finished one of our bigger ones, which I believe covered the Sierra, Sequoia, the Stanislaus, and the El Dorado, and was a 3-year contract. And luckily there's Wade now, who's going to be talking this afternoon, who kind of took over that role, because it gets to be a lot for one person, especially since with cone collections, it's kind of it's an all or none sort of deal. And for a few weeks, you're kind of just go, go, go. And then the rest of the time you're sort of planning and getting everything ready. But that's my experience with the collection side of things. I'm also a climbing instructor for the Forest Service. And so I've done the actual active cone collecting myself. This is one of the sides where I've tried to bring into this presentation a bit, is working with the contractors and what makes a successful contract and how you pick trees and stands. And it's something that I've found when I've gone to other forests to help them out, is they haven't had that sort of education on what to look for. And so a lot of times they're not really picking what is the best stand essentially to go to. And so I just wanted to give you that quick little background before we get into this. So for cone collection standards, And Arnaldo covered a lot of this, so I'm not going to go into it too in depth. And like Arnaldo, if you guys have a question, just raise your hand and feel free to bring it up. I'll kind of ask intermittently, but ask as we go along so we can capture it right away. But Arnaldo and the region is going to provide us with what they sort of decide is needed, but that kind of gets filtered down and adjusted at the zone level, then at the forest level, and at the district level. And what I mean by that is, you know, Arnaldo will show the collection plan, which he kind of went over this more in depthly, but I have a copy of one of our old ones here. And we'll review it and we will see what's really applicable to us. And so I don't have it on this one. I remember one of our older collection plans had, you know, and he said red's high priority. So that's when you're planning, you want to go to red areas. We had in our collection plan that high elevation red fir was a high priority. Now for the Sierra National Forest, specifically the High Sierra Ranger District, the amount of ground that we're actually potentially going to plant that has red fir in it is very small. And so working with Arnaldo and them, we changed that priority. So we moved it so that it was no longer a high priority. And so that's how you're going to kind of adjust these to kind of cater them to your needs. This is also important with planning too, because you might have limited funds. Like usually with forests or with state, you're not going to be given, you know, infinity amount of dollars to go collect. And you want to try and address where you're going to best spend your dollars at. And so you want to hit those areas that are heavily impacted. And then knowing the history behind your forest is always really essential too. So one thing that I think is kind of sad for my seed zone on my district is low elevation sugar pine, specifically that's major gene resistant, the MGR. It's always going to be in the red and it's going to stay there because we have exhausted that seed source and we don't have any really left anymore. And so we could try everything we can do, but I think our lowest elevation sugar pine that we have that's MGR is at 5,000 feet. So we're always going to have 4,045 on there, and we're going to have to borrow from seed orchards or neighboring seed zones. And so it's just, it is what it is. But I have talked to Arnaldo and Gary, the seed bank manager, about, hey, are we at that time yet to where we're going to start collecting, you know, normal sugar pine or non-rust resistant sugar pine? And it's like, nope, there's too much in stock. So don't even think about it. So you want to consider those things when you're looking at your plants. So species considerations. I just talked about sugar pines. You want to know if you're at a point where you're going to look at non-rust resistant sugar pine for collecting. Incense cedar. If that's something that you're really interested in collecting, you want to consider how to sample it because it is very time-consuming collection. Everyone here is familiar with incense cedar. I just want to ask to make sure that is a very tiny cone. It's about this big. And I believe someone asked earlier, there are tables that give you estimates about how many seeds per cone, how many cones per bushel. Again, they're estimates. With incense cedars, it's something ridiculous. I want to say it's like 60,000 something cones make a bushel. And just so you guys know, there's a galvanized bucket in the back on the deal. That is a bushel bucket. So bushel is a volume of measurement. It's a measurement of volume. Sorry, I said that kind of backwards. It's something like 8 cubic liters or something weird like that. But that bucket right there holds a bushel. It's actually an apple bushel bucket. And there's a couple different ways you could use to measure that. But you imagine filling that up with cedar cones. It's going to take a long time. Douglas fir. Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say I think I know our collection and you as well. I think I started with you actually a few years ago.
Yep, I've been to yours.
Yeah. So we did a stand of incense cedars last year, and one of our incense cedars, this was they were on there all day collecting on that 17.
That's amazing for an incense cedar.
And that's just one of the 5 or 6 that was out there they really collected from. And I was really wanting to be on that one, but I ended up on one of the other parts of the contract on.
Yeah.
But I heard that they were just in heaven with that tree. It was so good.
Yeah, I mean, if you get one, and Jessica and Denia have some great photos of trees and actually incense cedars that look appropriate for collecting. So I'm going to let them share that. But yeah, when you get them that are just fully loaded, they actually, you can't really see the green on the tree. The tree almost looks dead from far away. it's drooping, and you just see this brown tree, and you get closer and you realize that it's brown because it's the cones covering it now. So Douglas fir, a lot of forests have Douglas fir as a high priority, and so you want to consider that. And then Douglas fir has a, propensity to go abort its cones. And so if you're going to be spending a lot of time on Douglas fir collections, you want to have stand A, B, C, D, E, F, backup stand after backup stand, because if you're going to be running a contract through there, Arnaldo kind of gave the example about he spent all this time driving and he gets to the stand only to find that, they all aborted. And it's kind of like, then what? Well, you want to be like, well, we're going to go right over here next and right over there. A lot of times with cone collection contracts, the contractors are kind of like, because it's time is money. The faster they work, the more money they make in the end. And so it's a nice balance of making it so you get your needs met and that they are still being profitable. And sitting there and kind of staring at maps and saying, well, let's go survey this stand now, is not going to be very feasible. And a lot of times it's going to, put you in a weird predicament. Coulter pine, it's a tree that requires a lot of effort. With a lot of cone collections, you can pop the cones off, break them off, brush them off, whip them off. Coulter pine, you have to saw them off. They're a very sturdy cone, very big cone. My sugar pines are our longest cone. Coulter pines are the most voluminous cone. So again, there's a lot of effort. And then again, with white bark, Arnaldo touched on this earlier too. If you're going to be doing white bark collections, these are cones that have a really high predation rate with birds. And so if they are a seed source that's really valuable to you, you want to consider the use of cages ahead of time. So taking that extra effort to go pre-cage them, because it's going to be really hard to beat out the environment with white bark collections. The birds are just going to eat that cone up before you ever get a chance to. So agency considerations. So with the Forest Service, we're going to be usually guided by a collection plan. It's not going to be your silviculturist just going rogue out there and kind of doing what they want. And then you're going to want to take some considerations for single trees versus stands. And this is one of the areas where CAL FIRE does differ. CAL FIRE does not do single tree collections. The Forest Service will do single tree collections. And we even have a spot on our tags for it that says, if it's a single tree collection versus a stand. I think one of our most perfect examples are our rust-resistant sugar pines. That's going to be a single tree that's collected specifically because it is tested and known that it is resistant to rust. And so there might be other reasons that we do a single tree collection. Maybe it is, a tree that has a ton of cones, that's high value. You guys really want it for some reason. It's something you really need to talk over with your geneticist about, because there are some pitfalls with single trees. When you start seeing the one load tree by itself and you don't see any other trees of that species nearby, there's probably a high chance that the seed is not viable because it's not getting another source to pollinate it. And so you see, like I know with us, we've been looking real heavily at lower elevation ponderosa pines to kind of refill our seed banks. We've had a lot since the beetle mortality event and then creek fire. We have to be real careful if we come across just that single ponderosa pine that's by itself at 2,000 feet versus a nice stand of ponderosa pines. You also want to consider how many bushels you want to collect, if you have a limit based off of funds, or if you're putting a limit on the tree. A lot of times, if it's a sugar pine and we've already spent that much time, we're going to collect the entire tree. It doesn't matter. Every cone that you can get to, you're going to get it. And that this kind of leads into the next one with which parts of the tree. Sometimes there'll be the fact that we only collect the upper 2/3 of the crown and leave the bottom third of the crown. I've talked to geneticists that fall on both sides of it. Some geneticists feel that the bottom third of the crown has the possibility to be self-pollinated, and some geneticists have said that trees, while they can self-pollinate, they won't produce a viable seed. So there's both theories out there. It's really going to be something that you kind of make a decision. Again, I always discuss things with either Arnaldo or Gary and go from there and kind of to develop a best course of action. The biggest thing you want to consider, though, when you're doing these collections is diversity. And if you have a lot of funds and you're looking at ponderosa particularly, because that's the species that we've been trying to collect a lot, and you have multiple elevation bands that you're going over, you don't want to spend all your money on that one spot, because then you're just going to get the genetics from that one area. And if you have the ability to move them around, and this is where you want to make sure you have that written in your contract, that the government representative has the ability to stop collections at any point for any reason. And that might be specifically just to move the contractors to another stand. And trust me, kind of like, I'm sorry, what was your name again?
Oh, Christina Wilkins.
Because Christina was saying where they had cedar pines that were having, or cedar trees that were having 17 bushels per tree. You know, I had a similar situation with a contract where the ponderosa stand just had, you know, buku bushels, and the climbers were in heaven. They could just sit there and go nuts. Well, after we got, you know, so many bushels, I was like, okay, we're moving to the next part. And they're just like, no, why would we do that? Like, we don't want to leave. We're making money. This is easy climbing. It's a good stand. And it's just like, well, I need another elevation band and I need a different area. I want to capture all the genetics on our forest. And so you just need to make sure you have that written into your contract correctly to allow for that ability to do that. So selection criteria, now that we've kind of considered the planning with the agency, you want to pick the right tree to collect. And so this is going to be something as in tree status. So everyone familiar with the dominant versus a co-dominant tree out there. You want to look at how the tree's doing. Is it highly vigorous, or does it look like it's in poor health? The overall tree size, its collection history. A lot of times our rust resistant sugar pines, we keep a very detailed collection history on them. The access to the tree, Arnaldo touched upon this a little bit. You could have a great tree or stand to collect, but the access might be very, very difficult to get to. And so you need to start weighing where time is going to create an issue. Usually stands that are going to be the most profitable and make the most sense are going to be stands that are near a road, are easy to get to, and that you have the ability to get bushels back to cars quickly. I don't think a lot of people realize is that after you're carrying bushels of, you know, even ponderosa cones all day, they're heavy and you start to get tired. Now, if you imagine you're 2 miles out away from a road and you have to figure out how to hike 50 bushels of ponderosa cones back in. So it's just things to kind of get all worked out ahead of time. Do you need a UTV? Do you need an ATV? That sort of thing. And then the climbability of the tree. And so this is something that when I've worked with other foresters before, that it comes up quite a bit is you see they will pick a tree and they see the cones on it and they're just like, yep, these are fantastic cones. We're going to go after it. And then you see this giant tree. And there's probably 100+ bushels on this tree. But you're looking at branches that are kind of like this. You have these huge branches that are upsloping, a massive dominant tree that's out there, and you're just kind of like, well, it's going to take the climbers probably 2 hours just to get into the tree. And when you have these bigger branches like this, the climbers have to do a lot of limb walking and do a lot of redirections to get out to the tips of the branches. And so the amount of time that it takes to collect a bigger tree like this is also almost not worth it. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff that they miss, and it's going to be very hard on them. But this happens quite a bit because people will see this and be like, look at, like, we could spend all of our money on one tree. And it's like, you can, but do you want to? And you're probably going to have some pretty annoyed climbers on top of it. And this is compared to, I know this is on private land. Yeah, Marianne.
Say, would the exception to that be if it's one of the rust resistant sugar?
Yes, obviously the exception is with the rust resistant sugar. However, a really good question got brought up in our Southern California one is the climbers usually have a right to deny a tree when it comes to safety. So you may have this big wolfy old sugar pine, and if they're looking at it and they're like, you know what, there is no safe way that I can access this tree, I'm refusing it. That is their right to do it. And so if they think there's any safety consideration or issue, they have every right to turn it down. And before mortality, we did have a time where people actually removed rust resistant trees from the list because of issues with climbing. I couldn't imagine them doing that now. So, but yeah, an exception would be the sugar pines. Good question. But so we have this other tree. Jacob, did you have a question?
Yeah, what is your typical?
So we have a lot of the contracts I've done in our forest that they need to be 500 feet to the road. Wade, what have you put in the BPA?
It's between 500 and 1,000 for sure.
Yeah.
Less than 500.
Or between, 0 and 1,000 feet under that one.
And you also want to consider, the pitch of the slope. You could have something that's 100 feet from the road, but it's straight down a very steep slope. It's going to be a little difficult to get to. So I've never done a slope cutoff, but when I'm evaluating stands beforehand, I'll look at that, and it depends. Is the tree leaning? Is there a way to flip the cones up onto the road? There's all kind of things to consider with that. But at a certain point, if the slope's going to be such an issue that you're going to be like falling down it, trying to collect the stuff, then we might nix the tree. So.
The other thing we did last year when we were scoping areas is we nixed one of the whole section that was completely filled with poison oak, which means we would have been having to pick them up from full.
Yeah.
I was like, no, that's not happening. So we completely nixed that entire area because it was just, everywhere you stepped, everywhere you didn't want the climbers to have to deal with because we didn't want to deal.
Yeah, poison oak, that's a pretty good one. I know last year we dealt with a little bit of it, but it wasn't a flood of it, so we kind of said deal with it because it was just a few twigs. But so when you're evaluating your trees, you want to look at a tree that is obviously healthy, high vigor, at the co-dominant, dominant, tree status, but also that the branches haven't grown out so much that they're so far away that the climbers can't reach them. So I have a picture here of a tree on private land, but you have a nice healthy looking ponderosa with more medium-sized branches that are much easier to get to. They can bend the branches back to them because a lot of times when we're collecting, they're going to reach those branches and bend them towards them and just pop the cones off. They can climb up that pretty easily, but even better is when you actually find a stand like this. And this is a stand of trees that are all of a pretty equal size. So you have a co-dominant stand here. Ideally, what you would do here, if I were out looking for my district, is I would go through the stand and identify the trees, and if it was a good cone year, identify the trees that I didn't want them to climb, assuming that they all had an equal amount of cones on them. And if there was a few trees that were intermediate or suppressed in there, had maybe a broken top, signs of mistletoe, other evidence of disease, or maybe had a really low cone output on them, I would flag those trees. And so then I could take my group of climbers to the stand and say, hey, here's our stand. You guys pick the trees, but the ones that are flagged in pink are a no-go. And here are my reasons, and make sure they understand it. And it's a stand collection. You don't have to worry about all the bushels being separated. They can all go together and you could go nuts and you will see a blanket of cones on the ground. So that's kind of your ideal scenario right there. So in planning for this, we've talked about our needs for the forest, and you want to consider this, and Arnaldo touched in on this, and you're going to see a lot of overlap because we kind of want to make it, the nice progression. But the elevation and the aspects. So this is going to, this is going to be key with your planning for collecting. Obviously, stuff at a lower elevation is going to be ready before the higher elevation, and aspects going to play a role into that too because of how much sun and exposure the cones get. And so when you're looking at your cones, keep that in mind. And a lot of times you might want to keep a log or a journal of where they're at, what elevation, and what time you went and surveyed them. Species considerations are going to be your type of tree and whether it's a 1-year or 2-year cone that it's making. Sugar pines are a 2-year cone. And so sometimes you'll see the beginnings of next year's cone. So if I'm going out now and looking and I see the little tiny conelets that are out there, it might look like it will be a good one for next year, but maybe not this year. And it's stuff that you could keep in mind for the next year's needs. Weather forecasts, and I mean this in both the, leading up to it and then the actual days of. So you want to look for trends in weather, sudden spikes in temperature, especially when it's getting close to collecting, can cause cones to flare and open up immediately. So if you're at like a nice even temperature and then all of a sudden you get that weird heat snap, all the cones might blow and you might be finding yourself scrambling. The other things is if you're thinking like, okay, I'm going to start collecting in this next week, but then you get a big cool down, it might push out your collection a week or so. So how to put this in your contract appropriately is to make sure that your contractor is available to start within 24 hours, or you put in a time limit. You say that, you know, we're going to do a notice to proceed, and we want you guys to be on forest and ready to go within 24 hours, because I'm going to be sitting there predicting with the weather and hoping it all works out. Your route selection and access, we kind of already talked about that, but we want to make sure that you pick things that are easily accessible. But then also, if you're going to go to multiple locations, try to make something that's logical, so that you're going in a route where you hit things and you're not doing this. You're not zigzagging across your forest constantly. You can also put stop times in your contract too. So if you have a huge gap in elevations that you're collecting, you can say we might start, we can also stop. I'm not going to go too much into the contracts though, because Wade's going to be covering that with the federal BPA. And then supplies that you want to have with you are going to be your cone logs, cameras for photo taking, cone gun. I think the Stanislaus still has a cone gun, correct? Yeah, so the Stan and Sierra in the same, we both have it. No one can shoot it. But so if that's something that you guys can use or have the ability, other things that you might want to take out with you are a cone cutter. We'll get into that in the next one. X-Acto knives, but not to cut seeds. So the field surveys, it's really important to stress that the field surveys are hands-on approach out there. So a lot of times people think that they could just go and do like a quick drive-by, and it's something that you need to go and look and monitor. Because as Arnaldo pointed out earlier, sugar pines have done this, Douglas fir tend to do this. Everything might be going great, and you might be thinking like, we're going to have this great season, we're going to collect so many sugar pine cones, and then they abort them. And you want to know that when it happens, opposed to when you have your contractors there and you're going to go collect because you only did the one survey a few months ago and now you're dealing with the whole aborted crop. You also want to test the cones and the seeds. And so we'll go into some of the testing method. And the best way to do that is the cut face method. It's the most accurate. And I have an example of a cone cutter back there. It's something that is very easy to make. Anyone can make one. We literally went to, I think, Smart and Final and got a meat cleaver to make that one and put it on a board. We usually start doing cut faces in July on cones that we're interested in at lower elevations to see where they're at, and it helps us track where they are in development. That's weird. Okay. Okay, so methods to determine ripeness. Like I said, the cone bisection or the cut face method, this is going to be your most accurate method. Other things you could do is specific gravity. Each species of cone or seed has a specific gravity that you can tell that the seed is viable in. And there's a table in the cone manual that shows it. And so you could do this out in the field, assuming you have the right liquid. And but you need to know the correct liquid to use. And like so there are some of them, it's like kerosene you use for this. It gets a little crazy. Some of the other methods to use, but they aren't as reliable, are the color and sap production of the tree or the color of the cone. So there's guides that show how as the cone colors change that you might know when to collect. And that's definitely true. You don't want to collect a bright green cone, but there's other things you want to look at as well. And then ecosystems cues. These are a pretty last resort, but we're talking about when the birds start eating them, when the squirrels start dropping them all, when they start, I'm sure everyone's seen this, and the squirrels do all the, like the corn on the cob with the cones that you see all over the ground. Again, this is not going to be your most reliable method because a lot of the times the squirrels are going to go after them way early in the season. So not a great way to go about it. And so real quick here, I have some examples that were done on the Sierra of some cone bisection and then seed. So we have a sugar pine here that is very, very early, and that's the long one in the front. And I'll do the Arnaldo method here. So, okay, it's not that washed out. But you see the sugar pine here, well, it has a really high number of filled seeds in it. This is what you want to look for, is each one of these that are filled. It's really bad if you have only like a few. The axis of the cone is still really white. Everything is very, very white. The cone is green. It's just too early for this cone yet. And then we have a fir up there that we were just doing, for fun. I think it was easy for us to grab it. So, and we'd never looked at a fir seed before. But then we have some up close of the actual bracts of the sugar pine that help you tell when they're ready, and then doing the cut face on the seed. And so the sugar pine here, the top one is what it says is 1 day before collecting. And I think this is a very good example because you see how dark and brown the seeds are. And the seed wing is actually intact and pulling away from the bract of the cone. Where below you see a cone that is, not that far off in elevation. However, the seeds are still very orange. And you could also see that the seed wing itself, they're sticking to the bracts, and if you try and pop the seeds off the bracts, a lot of times that seed wing will still stick to it with it. And so that's still showing that it's a little too early. You want those nice dark brown seeds coming out. And here we have, this is a picture of looking at the seeds to see the development of it. What we're specifically looking at is the embryo of the seed, and we wanted to make sure that it's filling up at least 90% of the seed. In sugar pines and some of the bigger species, what's pretty neat is when they get really developed like this, sometimes you can even start seeing green on the tips of the little needles. But so you're looking at kind of the difference in colors. You can see that the embryo is starting to pull away from the other parts of the seed here. There's a slight difference in color, but it's definitely filled up 90% of that total seed right there. And so you know that it's nice along its path of development. So just a few safety things to consider with this. Obviously hazard trees. So sometimes people get so focused in on, wow, I found this great stand, or I found these perfect, here was this missing sugar pine that is rust resistant. We haven't found it for 5 years and I just discovered it again. And they fail to, do the assessment of the rest of the area around them and didn't realize that maybe there's a huge hazard tree leading into it. Other things like, can you mitigate it now? Do you want to mitigate it now? Or should you just move to another stand? Things like that. Falling hazards when you're actually collecting and out there are so hard hats are absolutely essential. As someone who has been hit by many of pine cones, trust me, you want that protection. Branches are going to break, everything's going to be coming out of the tree. And I do have a short video of sugar pine collections for you to watch, and you will see like it actually is a violent method to it. And then projectiles, some of the climbers shoot things into the tree, so they'll use different methods, whether it's a slingshot or what looks like, a bow and arrow. Or if they do have cone guns out there, there's going to be that whole issue with projectiles and cutting hazards. If you're using the meat cleaver cone cutter and then the X-Acto knife, you got to watch your fingers and whatnot. Exposure is always going to be an issue, especially during climbing. You find yourself out in the sun picking up cones, you get hot. So collection techniques. There's lots of ways to go about collecting, and it's really up to you to decide. The most common is the manual collections, or people climbing to do them. And the pros to this is that you can cater to the species. So there's some species that require certain techniques. For instance, they're not as commonly used anymore by contract climbers, but tree spurs or gaffs cannot be used on sugar pines. Their bark is too thin. But there are kind of a slower, heavier, more cumbersome way of climbing. So a lot of climbers are just using single rope or double rope techniques, which are pretty versatile amongst all the different species. With this, you can minimize your impacts on the tree overall, and you could really cater yourself to which cone on the tree you want to collect. And so you don't really have to worry, like if there's some bad spots or whatnot, you don't need to be concerned. And it can minimize cone loss that way. But on the other side, some of the cons of this are safety. Anytime you have somebody climbing, you have that risk of somebody falling. And so you want to make sure you have somebody who is knowledgeable in what they're doing. And with the Forest Service on this side, any cone collection contract that's out there, or climbing contract, I should say, has to help be developed or have someone working on it that is a climber themselves. And that's in our Forest Service policy. And that's to make sure that somebody is aware that the climbing is being done appropriately and not, people going rogue out there. And so you can imagine, like, if you have somebody falling out of a tree, it's not good. It can be time consuming. Yes.
So does that mean that?
Not necessarily. So I think they realized that there's so few climbers now in the federal side that it just needs to at least have been reviewed by somebody who's knowledgeable. So the COR doesn't have to be a climber anymore, but it kind of states that the contract itself needs to have been reviewed by a climber or someone who is knowledgeable with climbing techniques. So, yes. Yeah, so the federal government does have its own climbing program, which is actually multi-agency. And so it covers US Forest Service, BIA, BLM, and USDA. And I actually want to include National Park System, but I can't remember off the top of my head right now if we have anyone currently in NPS that is a climber. So, but that's its own certification system in itself, yeah. Okay, so again, one of the overalls is that it's a very technical and specialized training for both sides of it. So real quick, I got a video of sugar pine collections for you. I'm playing it through Teams, so we have to deal with our internet, so sorry. So I'm not sure if you could capture it that well, but basically with sugar pines, what they'll do and when they're ripe and go is they will stand at the end of the branches and just whip them. And or they'll kick them with their legs and the cones go flying every which way. And so you can see what a hazard it could be to those standing on the ground. You usually just have to stand back. I actually took out a car with one of my climbing partners once. So they can be bad, but when you do it right, it breaks off the cone right at the peduncle, which is the stem for the cone, and it minimizes any other damage to the tree, which is ideal. And so this is a great way to do collections on a tree because you're not going to be sitting there and breaking off branches, which are then producing future cones. Okay, mechanical collections. Not as common. These include tree shakers, shooting the cones. Same thing, cone guns. People will try and shoot the cones down. Cages, rakes, nets. And then there's destructive collections. And so we talked again a little bit about cedars earlier and how they have so many cones on them. Despite all the mortality and the fire that we've had here on my district, cedars are in the category of somewhat of a weed for me. And when we have collected them, just because we were a little low on one of our numbers, we have done destructive collections where we'll find trees in areas where they need to be thinned out anyway. And look, there was a few that had a good amount of cones on them. I have a seasonal workforce crew of about 12 people. If we just fall the tree, put tarps down, put those 12 people down, you can actually collect them a lot quicker than having one person sitting up in the tree. And so it's something to consider with, if you're willing to do that, but you could do some destructive collections that weren't so much intentional. For those of you that might be doing a thinning, logging, any sort of that, they might be a secondary, like, hey, they're already taking this out. We're going to go send out these people and collect that tree. And so there's no reason why you can't do that, or the group of trees. The pros of this is that it could be time efficient and you can get a lot of yield on it. And it's not very technical and anyone can do it once the tree's on the ground. But the cons of it are pretty straightforward, is that does killing a tree outweigh getting all of it? Yes or no? You're not going to get that tree back. It's weather dependent, and the timing also needs to be perfect. So if you go and cut down the tree and the cones aren't ready, it's kind of a loss all the way around. So aerial collections, it's been a long time since some of these have been done in Region 5. I don't, Arnaldo, do you know when the last one was done? I want to say it was 80 something. Yeah. 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 So these are going to be very high yield, and you can access really difficult areas, and it can really minimize your time. You can have this done in a day. But on the other side of it, it's an extremely expensive collection to do. And it requires some very technical training because you need a helicopter operator and the ground crew on top of that as well. Very weather dependent, and a lot of times these are very damaging to the trees because in most cases it's going to take the whole top of the tree off or most of the branches. So what they'll do is I have some photos of it. You see the big buckets will come down, and it will either, some of them cut the top off, some of them try and rake it off. Most of the times it's not very kind to the tree. Dump on the ground and you process from there. Some not so common collections or uncommon collections are squirrel caches, or ground collections. We actually did one on the High Sierra, I believe it was 2015. We collected our sequoia grove through squirrel collections. However, and I have this in the cons, this required really, really precise timing. And the only way that it was feasible is because we were already working in the area with a project and we were able to see it every day. And just going out there every day. And then I noticed that one day the squirrels just went nuts. And it was towards the end of September, early October. And it looked like it was raining cones out there. And we were able to get 5 bushels of sequoia from that. And we literally ran around and got them. Other types of squirrel, you'll actually find the caches in the logs to do it. And so I know I have another one up here is a uncommon collection of public collection. I believe it was Michigan DNR was paying people to bring in bushels of cones. And so they just put an ad in the paper that said, bring in your red pine. We'll take them for you. We'll pay you, I think it was $65 or $75 a bushel. So pros of this, no impacts to the trees. They're safe. Anyone can do it. It can limit your impacts on staff too. Cons, there's a lot of cons on this. Quality could be, really unknown. And I do want to throw out, this is another, CAL FIRE does not do ground collections or squirrel collections. I'm sorry? Danielle.
Do not have the capacity to monitor it. Like she was saying, the only reason they did it is because they were there every day.
Is also from back of
I did not know that.
talk to them.
We only did it the one time because it was there. I would not go actively seeking these out because of a lot of ground collections are going to have a mold issue, and mold is going to be your biggest, reason why you lose your cones. So the predation on them and seed loss is going to be high, and you could have a mixed bag of what you're getting. You could ask for ponderosa, and you could look in there and you have ponderosa, Jeffrey, sugar pine, and you're like, great, now I have to sort through this. So the timing is going to be difficult on it too with some of them. And these are some pictures of some ground collections for you on squirrel caches. Again, like I mentioned, uncommon methods. So, and real quick to wrap this up, I'm going to go into storage and shipping to kind of create the full circle, and you guys will have a break, and then we're going to do a little exercise on how to select trees and stuff like that. So when you're actually out in the field, cones should be collected very quickly, and you don't want to just leave them in the sun. The more they sit in the sun, the more they bake, the more it can ruin the seed. And you want to make sure you use proper bags. And these are bags that have the ability to breathe and have air circulate through them. And so we have examples of bags in the back as well. The burlap are the Forest Service bags, and the green ones are CAL FIRE bags. And you need to bag them correctly. And again, Denya and Jessica have a great photo of the how-tos and how-don'ts with this. But basically, you need to allow the cones room to expand. And so you're going to secure the top of it. If you do it too low, the cones aren't going to expand out right. You got to do it nice and high so they have, what will happen is they will keep developing and they will open up within the bags, and you do them when they're all closed tight. It's crazy how much room they end up taking up and how much lighter they get. So during the day while you're collecting, you want to make sure that the stuff you collect all throughout the day stays in shade as much as possible. You don't want to just let it bake in the sun. And labeling is huge. So we have tags. We both have examples of tags back there. I think our tags are really similar, and we have the same standard, a tag in the bag and a tag on the bag, because you never know if the tag on the bag is going to get ripped off, something happens to it, then a tag in the bag will help us know, or when I say us, I mean the nursery who has to process it. And obviously you want to keep them dry. So if you're collecting somewhere and it's really damp, moist, get the cones out of there as quickly as possible. And this is just the up close of our tag, but again, we have one in the back. I have a stack of them back there. You could look at it. Do that again. It's stupid. Bear with me. Okay, so when you're storing them after you get them in from the field, you want to keep them in a protected area, ideally, that's enclosed and warded off from predators. It's amazing how fast you'll see squirrels, rabbits, mice, all that. They could smell the cones. They want to go after them. We personally use our tree coolers. So our tree coolers are set at a very low temperature for when they have seedlings. What we do is we set them to ambient temperature so that the fans stay on. And so if it's, typically going to be around 80 degrees, we'll set it to 80 degrees. And then we have screen doors that we've made to fit inside the cooler door so that we could leave the door open and it's replaced with the sealed door. And that way they go on racks, laying flat, and the fan is circling through, and you flip the bags constantly. You're going to constantly be moving them around. And all of this is to prevent mold. Cool, dry, shady, and closed protected areas. That's going to be your friend. I've seen other examples where people hang them. They've done hanging bags like in a barn or an area that keeps it out of the sun. Your biggest issues are going to be improper bagging, a temperature irregularity or moisture or some sort of issue that's going to promote mold growth inside the bags, and that's going to lead to cone loss. Nope. Nope, you just use airflow and the natural process of them drying out. And that's why you want to keep flipping them. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. Very careful with that because that have forests that have done it. They got a lot of bags molded. So you got to be constantly bags. I'd rather have stored like in some shaded area and have a lot of circulation going, because that's the natural process also of drying them out and opening. Make things easier once they get to the nursery. Of course, it's going to create more volume for transportation. But
yeah. And some species have a bigger issue than other species with mold, like sugar pine has a predisposition. I mean, it's so sappy and wet and everything. It's going to have that like tendency to go get moldy opposed to some of the drier cones. The day of transportation. So this is something that you can't just throw them all in a truck and go, even though I have a picture of them all thrown in a truck and going, but you still need to consider the temperature of that day and what it's going to look like, because you want your drive time. I know it takes us about 4 hours to get from our cone storage to the nursery. And so we're probably going to be leaving fairly early in the day so that the majority of the time driving is spent in the early hours so the cones aren't directly exposed to the sun. Other things that have happened though is 1 year we did a huge collection amongst multiple forests, and we had like, I think close to 700 bushels of cones. And so the nursery sent down a reefer truck for us, and it had pallets so that they could stack them in, but it kept them all enclosed so that we didn't have to worry about them baking in the sunlight. The route you're going to take, you need to factor that in again, because you want to minimize any impacts of all of them just sitting and baking in the sun. Weather, obviously, if you have everything planned and you're going to go on this day and it's supposed to rain, you probably want to postpone that trip. You don't want them just going out in the rain all day. Compressing them and the circulation is a big deal too, but as they've dried out a little bit, you don't want to, it's not one of the bigger factors, but you don't want to sit there and smush them all down either. And the biggest thing that I want to stress about this one is communication. And so you want to make sure that the nursery is aware that you're coming and you're going to be showing up with a bunch of cones to be delivered, and that you've pre-worked this out. Because if you do show up to the nursery with 300 bushels of cones and they have no idea that you're going to be there, you might cause some issues. So, and they might not have the staff or the ability to take that from you. So, I'm going to leave this up for just a little bit while we take a break. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I figure we'll just keep moving on, and that way Denia and Jessica can have more time. These are all references that I used for the slide if people want to use them at all, but we can also send out the presentations to everybody. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll take 15 and start back up at 10:45.
So while she's getting that set up, I'm Jessica Huang. I'm the state seed bank manager for CAL FIRE, and we're located in Davis. And quick background, I got my bachelor's in wildlife conservation, and I got my master's in ecology, evolution, and systematics. And I did some habitat restoration work, and then through that and networking, I worked for CAL FIRE for the last 5 years, all at the seed bank. So yeah, this one. Okay. So the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and this is our mission, is to serve and safeguard the people and protect the property and resources of California. And this is just a bit of a background of the agency. So we have about 7,000 permanent staff, and during peak fire season, about 10,000. We currently have around 265 resource management, but we have the capacity for 325. So like most agencies, we are very short-staffed. And keep in mind, for the state of California, the seed bank, it's just me and Denia as full-time staff members trying to organize and coordinate everything each cone season. And so these are the various programs we have in the resource management programs. And the one that the LA Moran Reforestation Center is under wildfire resilience. So here's a really old, I don't know, for those who have been there, this is like a really old photo of it. And the Davis, the Reforestation Center is open to anyone who wants to come take a tour, take a look around of our equipment. Just, let me know. Our cards are in the back. Old photos of the seed processing, cone processing, and if you do come visit, you'll see that it's very different now. But here's a timeline of our state nursery system. I won't go through all of it, but the important ones to note are the reestablishment of the nursery program. And the seed bank, even during budget cuts, was not shut down, but it was pretty bare bones. We had 2 staff members that just kind of kept the lights on, made sure the freezer was running. And I think there was a year where they couldn't accept any cones because they couldn't process. There's just not enough people to do all of it feasibly. And so right now we have a manager, we have 2 forestry assistant 2s, 1 environmental scientist, and the nursery side, we have our senior environmental scientist, which is Kuldeep, his assistant nursery manager, and during the busy times, we have 4 seasonal forestry aides that are just extra hands to help us with processing and testing. And this is a lot, but it's our cycle of what we do at the facility. And what Denny and I are responsible for is the cone survey up top, the cone sampling, cone collection, which we work with our units and other agencies, the processing, seed extraction, the seed storage, seed orders, and the other half of the circle is Kuldeep's responsibility. So if you have questions about that part, you can track him down during the break. And what Danny and I will be talking about specifically is the survey, the sampling, cone collection. If there's time, I can go into processing, but we'll see. And some storage tips. And if you have other questions about seedling orders or stratification, you can also speak to us during the break. Here's a general timeline, and as Olivia said, it's variable throughout the year, weather, species, but this is for CAL FIRE when we have our operations going. So our memo went out recently, and we should be expecting a survey soon-ish. And then during July, August, we sample cones, which I'll go into that as well. And then we have collections based off of the sampling. And then we have processing and storage October to whenever. So right now we're doing our germination testing to get those rates for our lots from 2021. For overview of our talk, we'll talk about surveys, both in paper form and this app that we've developed. Our needs, our sampling procedures, what we look for, our collection, and for contracting, because it is a bit different than Forest Service. So what is the goal? The goal is to meet future reforestation needs of California through cone collections containing viable seed from wide range of seed zones and elevations. And so like, I think I have a slide of the seed, handout of the seed zones, and you can see how it's broken down. And so our goal is to, like the Forest Service, is to get a representative sample from different seed zones in different elevations. And so now Dania is going to go over how we did our seed assessment, and I'll hand that over to her.
I'm gonna sit for a little bit. So my name is Jenya Troxel. I went to UC Davis for my undergrad, and I'm getting my master's in plant breeding from Iowa State. I started working at the seed bank in June of 2020, so I'm kind of new, nowhere near the expertise as our Arnaldo, but hey, I'm trying to learn. So another thing, one of the things that the seed bank has done, or at least we're trying to develop, is now that Jessica and I, before it was just Jessica, and now I'm also here to help, but there are only 2 of us for the entire state of California. I do want to make a distinction between the Forest Service and CAL FIRE. The Forest Service does not sell seed to any landowner directly. CAL FIRE has a seed bank, that's what it's for. So for us, the priority is going to be lower elevation seed where there is reforestation needs for private non-industrial landowners. So to develop that kind of priority list that we have, we did a similar assessment to what Arnaldo did, but for those areas that are not higher elevation. So a lot of the U.S. Forest Service tends to be a little bit higher elevation. What we're looking for is more lower elevation. So keep that in mind. I did do a GIS assessment, very similar. We used a little bit of a different data set. So our data is primarily geared towards our units. So CAL FIRE is divided within units. And so we have our unit foresters. And these foresters allow us to be out there through California whenever possible. And they know their region, they know their area, they know their property, the property boundaries. A lot of the collections we do are in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service or on private lands. So that's a little bit different. The private land aspect is kind of that development that the unit forester has with their landowners. They kind of have that relationship. And because Jessica and I are really the only ones in Davis, which is not necessarily like central all the way, but they help us. You know, we can't be everywhere. So we really rely on our unit foresters to kind of tell us what is out there, what you guys see, and who would be willing to allow us on their land. One little thing is, if you guys know of a good cone crop that is on private land, please get a hold of your unit foresters. and you can talk to Jessica and myself and we'll give you a list. But the reason is we do hold a portion of any collection that is done on private land, and it's reserved for that private landowner in our seed bank. So should they need any sort of seed later on, they'll have that portion for them that's reserved. The rest of it will be for us to sell to the public if needed. So keep that in mind. That's kind of important whenever you're considering things. So from my part on the assessment, I did very similar to what Arnaldo did, but this is more geared towards our unit foresters. So Arnaldo's are more like their forest, and this is more through the entire state of California. But the process is very similar. So what we did was we did a GIS layer for a baseline, and we did a 25% reforestation of non-industrial lands along the burn and took burned areas into account of higher than 100%, or sorry, of higher than 100 acres. To establish priority, basically what we did was we sorted the areas from highest to lowest, and we gave them a color. Red is going to be the highest priority that we currently have. You can't really see it that well in all of the monitors, but there's like a yellow, and that's a medium priority. And a low priority is less, or white there, or less than 10. That's the number of bushels. So the way I did this was we took the GIS layer, I grabbed those species that Arnaldo described, so like the Klamath mixed conifer species, the ponderosa that was present. We excluded higher elevation species or areas that were not priorities for us to collect or ability to collect. Then what I also did was I matched it to our inventory. So the inventory is also in there, and then I included the fire layer, which is what you see there for that. So what I ended up with is not like a nice graph or anything like Arnaldo has, but this really long list of species. So you'll see there's species, seed zones, elevation bands within 500 feet, the number of bushels that we need, the unit that it would affect, and then the fire name that went by on that unit. So you see the red part right here, that's going to be our highest priority areas. This is the next priority, medium priority, and the white one is lowest priority. And you see these negative numbers, if you can tell, there's like a -10 down here where my mouse is. That's because we have surplus, so we're probably not going to make that a collection that we really want. What I'm working on this year is to talk to each of our unit foresters and basically do the same thing that Arnaldo is doing, where we go through each section of it and say, hey, this is what ideally we want to reforest, but really what's feasible? Like, this is not going to be feasible. So we're working on it this year to get more collaboration. I do want to say that this is something that we just started since I started. So it's only like a 2 or 3 year assessment that we've done so far. It gets reevaluated every year because our inventory changes every year. But this sort of analysis hadn't been done before. The center has been around for about 100+ years. We've had a lot of knowledgeable staff, but we've been understaffed. So these kind of things, we're slowly shifting more towards an analytical approach to dealing with things, more so, and that's kind of like the trend that we want to keep going. So here is what it's going to look like for our units. So when I talk to our units, this is basically what we're going to discuss. So what you see here is basically like that table that Arnaldo showed, but a little bit more confusing. So we're going to start here. And the whole point is you're going to search for your unit, and it's going to tell you what bushels you'll need for what elevation. That is the main gist of this. And the reason why I'm showing this to all of you guys is because obviously we have some of our unit staff here, so they're aware. I'm also aware that not everyone got this list. So please email me or Jessica, and you should be able to get this. But what I plan to do is call each unit forester, and we can go over it. So for us, the summary of our needs throughout the state, throughout the elevation bands, throughout the seed zones. So this is like our main kind of list right here, and you can see that it's very similar to what the U.S. Forest Service kind of needs. So ponderosa pine, and this is all in bushels. So the amount of bushels that we would need to reforest 25% of the land mass in California for private non-industrial landowners is this. It is very high. Like, this is a lot of bushels. This is obviously a target. We're never likely to reach this, but this is something of a baseline to have while we're there. So far, is there any questions? I'm kind of rushing through this. No? Okay. Arnaldo might be able to answer that better. The question was, what's the difference between Sierra red fir and did you say redwood? Red fir, regular red fir. Yeah, so the classifications were grabbed by the CalVeg. Okay. Yeah, so I grabbed I grabbed the classifications from the CalVeg layer, so that was just like a definition for it, but I could definitely look it up a little bit more for you. So we're gonna get into cone crop surveys. Okay. Jessica's gonna talk a little bit more about that if we don't have any other questions.
So a lot of what I'm gonna say is gonna be overlapped with Olivia's, but it's still very important information. So the point of the survey is to inform LMRC of any potential cone crops in our units. And I'll go over the timing, short-term and long-term preparation. Like Olivia said, you can see next year's cones perhaps. And if there aren't any, if there is not a good crop this year, make a note. I see conelets for next year. That tells us to be prepared for next year. The more information, more good information, the better. Our seed assessment, inventory management, and periodicity tracking. So getting that cyclical data set that Arnaldo was talking about, we're currently working on that. We're digitizing historical records, and hopefully we can extrapolate some interesting data from that. And the goal is to survey as many sites as possible to get a good range of information from your units. Here's our seed zones. Should be in that handout, but you can see there's a lot, and there are multiple seed zones within each CAL FIRE unit. So know what seed zones are within your unit, and if you have a seed zone that is split between different units, work with that unit forester. And sometimes or every year we work with the Forest Service. So if you do see cones somewhere from a good vantage point and you see the ownership is Forest Service land, feel free to contact me or Arnaldo. We'll get that forest manager's information and hopefully coordinate something. So here's our CAL FIRE cone survey form. This is the paper form, and we're gonna go over the app, or Daniel will go over the app later. So this is the form we've been using for a very long time, and our foresters are very familiar with this paper. It's a good backup to have if your phone isn't working, or if you just want to use paper, you can do that too. But the date, who the ratings by, the seed zone, elevation, township range and section, and we're hoping with the app, it makes it less time consuming to fill out all this information as you're just writing numbers over and over again. And there's, chance for error. And we're hoping that things like township range and section will be auto-populated later on the computer. So we're trying to make it as a quick data entry for you as possible. And Daniel will go more into this. So the motor log is important because when this was developed, there wasn't really using GPS. So if you found a good vantage point or a stand of trees, the motor log, when I read back to the historical surveys, are like, after you take this left turn, you'll see like a red tire in the stream, and the stand is like X amount of feet by the red tire, if that red tire exists when you get there. So motor log can be important. And comments on the stand, maybe it's not a good year this year for that stand, but make a comment maybe next year. And we'll go over the ratings with like visually too, so you can know what's few cones versus many cones. and which part of the tree we're looking at. And it's important that even if you don't see anything, that you note that. So no information or no cones is still information. It goes into our periodicity tracking, and it also just tells us that there's nothing there, and not that you didn't go to check it. So like I said, there's two ways to do the surveys. We have our paper forms, and the cone survey app will be discussed later. Some items to bring: binoculars, the paper forms, your smartphone or tablet if you're gonna try to do it on the app, a GPS, camera. Oftentimes people are not sure, so send me photos. That's totally okay. I'd rather go through the photos and try to answer as many questions as I can and see if it's a good crop than to get there taking a bigger risk than we needed to and have it not be a good crop. So the procedure for these surveys. So it's done on a stand basis, not single trees. So we've had surveys in the past where they say heavy, and I call them, or Dania calls them, we're like, what do you mean by heavy? You get really excited because you don't see heavy crops very often. And they go, oh, I saw these 2 trees. They were loaded with cones, but we're not looking for 2 trees. That's not our goal here. So stand basis, and we have a cone crop survey memo that we can distribute as well. That lists more specifically what our criteria are. I won't go too in depth in them. So you want to observe current year's cones. We don't want last year's cones. We don't want cones on the ground. We've had that before where they're like, it's a great year, and they send me a photo of the ground. No. Be sure to observe the trees within the stand, not just along the side of the road. We can collect roadside trees. It's not ideal for it to be only roadside trees because sometimes they are planted. We're not quite sure where they're from, especially if they really line the highway and they're very evenly spaced. That's kind of a red flag. We want to go into the stand, and also trees along the side of the road get kind of a disproportionate amount of sunlight, and they can ripen much differently at different times. We use a separate form for each site, and we're hoping that you visit at least 10, maybe 20 to 30 well-distributed sites. So it is not just a one-day thing. There will be a lot of driving involved to hit up all the places representative of your area. And it's good to find a good vantage point that you can kind of overlook kind of a lot of trees, because if you're on the ground looking up all the time, your scope is a lot narrower. I kind of already went over this, but this is a filled out by yours truly, Zolt over there. I always like his surveys. Shout out to you. But you can see the motor log, good information, not just on the side of the road or in the stand. Good information, what he observed, the glare on the screen. Yeah, it's just good information for you to know. And he saw dog fur, it was medium. I'll call him up, say, can you describe it to me? Some things to keep in mind. It's helpful to send a map that marks, because oftentimes when Danny and I go check up on the crop, the unit foresters or whoever the forester is they're very busy or they're on a fire. So having more information for us to locate and not drive around guessing where you saw the stand, it saves us time and energy, and it lets us check up on more sites. Pictures, helpful. Do not count spent cones. Do a separate rating for each species within, it's columned. And so we want the trees bearing cones in the stand. And we know that within different stands and different areas, a heavy, for that area, a heavy might mean something a little different in a different area. Yeah.
What does CRW stand for?
Post redwood. So let's see. And Danny is gonna go through the cone survey app.
So there's no questions so far, right? So one of the things that the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE are kind of in the process of trying to kind of take underway is developing one app that will actually work for both of us. Currently, what we're going to present is 2 different apps. This is going to be mainly for CAL FIRE folk, but can also be used by an external source as long as they can contact one of us, Jessica or myself. We'll give you access to it, and you can also use this. But you do have to have an Esri account, which a lot of you probably already do. So it's just an ArcGIS, AOL kind of ArcGIS account, sorry. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is this particular portion of it, I'm going to go a little bit fast on, and it's just because a lot of you don't currently have this app, and this recording will be made available, so you can kind of go through the steps as well. But so the app itself, you're going to have to download it. It's called Field Maps. You do have to make sure that your GPS location is on when you're using it. And no other application should be on. And the reason is it's going to slow down your phone really, really a lot. It's going to slow it down significantly, and you really don't want that. Unless you do, but I don't think most people want that. Hopefully it's a little bit easy to see, but let's say you want to use this app. You've downloaded Field Maps. You're interested in trying to see how to put these points down. You're going to contact Jessica or myself, and we need to have a person, her name is Kelly Larvey, and she'll give you access to what is called the Cone Crop Survey. And that is where we record all of our points that are inputted from our unit foresters or anyone that's doing surveys for us or with us as well. So you're going to get this kind of map looking thing right here. If you could see maybe not, my browser. You're going to collect it, and you're going to be able to see this map, and it's going to show you your current location. And from there, you would click that blue button, that plus sign, and it's going to add a point to wherever you want to do it. And from there, you're going to come up with a pop-up menu, and it's going to look like this, the one that says collect. And I realize, I apologize, it's kind of hard to see it. The glare is a little bad on there. But it's basically going to come out with this form, and it's going to simulate that paper form. It's going to have the species. It's going to have your ratings for the stands. It's going to have your township range and section, and we're looking to get that autofilled. It might not look like it's going to get autofilled, but it gets autofilled in the back end. So you're going to input your rating criteria. There's a cool little button that we currently have on there, and it's to take a picture. So all of this information gets sent to us to our database, and that's kind of like the centralized system for Jessica and I to review. So you don't have to send anything into us directly, but those pictures are really great because like Jessica was just saying, it's nice for us to see what you guys are seeing. And sometimes what you see is not necessarily what we would rate or anything like that. So you're going to fill in as many fields as you can. Yes.
Would the people going out and doing the cone collection also be using this to identify where that tree or stand is?
So not the cone collection, because the cone collection, there's different processes. So this is just the survey part. Then once we get the information, Jessica and I will sift through it, look at the ratings, look at the photos. Then we still have to do some other things like a cone cut test to determine whether or not it's a viable collection. Then after that, we would have the information from this and we would say, okay, let's follow that. But it would mainly be from our end, not necessarily the people doing cone collections. Gotcha. So once you have everything filled in, there's a little check mark that you'd have to be able to click on in order to send the data into our field or into our database. There is a different way to do this. This does require an internet access unless you're going to work offline. And so in order to do that, you have to download the offline map. And you can do that very easily by changing your mode and putting it into offline mode, in which case you have the ability to expand your area from either like a room, a county, or city, and so forth. So you kind of have to think ahead. Okay, I'm going to go to this area. Let's expand it and collect that map as much as possible because I won't have service in that area. And here is a little bit more of how you would do that. You would go to an offline area, and then there's like a little area zone that you could click on, and it changes it. There's like room, there's city, and so forth. And you would pick the map that would accommodate where you're going. And so in order for you to go back, so switch, because once you go back into the Wi-Fi area, you do have to switch Wi-Fi back on and be able to upload all of your data. And so you have to switch it back to working online. And it's very easy to tell because you go to your cone crop survey map and it'll tell you there's like a little writing that says offline work area where the red arrow is on the bottom right-hand side. And so you could tell. So you just have to switch that and then submit your data. This current app is like a lot of things that we're currently updating and working on to make better. There's certain things that we're adding to it, which one of them is going to be a route tracker, which will be really nice for Jessica and myself to kind of view where you guys are going or whoever's doing the survey. Another thing we're trying to do is just make things more auto-populated so that you basically just kind of put in your point, you do very minimal things, but all of that is in the process. And that is kind of one of those things that we're just working on in the seed bank. It's just a process that we're so slowly evolving, just like a lot of things. But yeah, so we're currently working on that, and hopefully the joint app between both of us will be a lot more user-friendly for both agencies and make it easier for whoever is using it so that we have a central database that we can both look at and collaborate. Jessica touched on this a little bit. The U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE does have an agreement that we are able to kind of collaborate together. So if there is a cone crop at the U.S. Forest Service site, we're able to collect, and then they reserve a portion of it for themselves. And as well as if we have something that they're able to collect as well, we kind of trade information. And so we're slowly trying to do more and more of that because we realize that as individual agencies, it's really going to be hard for us to go at it alone. Like we have to start making more partnerships, and we have partnerships, but we also have to have the personnel there to help us. But anyway, that's also part of the reason why we started developing this training, is because we want to kind of show everyone the joint effort. A lot of our criteria and our information is the same. It's just you're looking at, you know, different locations and different abilities. CAL FIRE is a little bit, for the seed bank side, we don't have a geneticist, so we don't have an Arnaldo to help us. A lot of the times we refer to him to help us with certain things. It really is just Jessica and myself. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at a crop out there and you see it's not necessarily on U.S. Forest Service side, but please let us know if it is for on any like property or anything else, because we do have an agreement together, and it really is kind of more of a beneficial thing for us to all collaborate, especially since, like I said, the U.S. Forest Service does not sell seed, but the seed bank from CAL FIRE does. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to go to a climber considerations.
So part of the motor log, like I mentioned before, is like road access and the terrain, because that tells me whether or not it's feasible to collect. If it's really steep and rocky or full of poison oak, unlikely. If there's a lot of safety concerns, it could be a really beautiful crop, which is heartbreaking, but if you can't get to it or you can't hike the cones out, it's not feasible. And I've had personal experience where I'm hiking up a giant like duffel of incense cedar and the bag rips, and it's so steep and it's like the worst day ever. So keep that in mind, and also with that same story, make sure your gear is good. Make sure the bags are taped up or you need a new bag. Just minimize stuff like that. And also keep in mind, the climbers have to hike in their gear. there's ladders, there's ropes, there's bags, buckets, whatever else they need. So if you might not want to hike that 5 mile end of a steep terrain, they probably won't either. And then you have to carry that out and the bushels. So you got to have enough people. And if it's not accessible with a car, with like 4-wheel drive sometimes, like you're looking at a really long day and a lot of grumpy, hangry people. We also don't want that. So information on the terrain is good. What's the ground cover like? Like this is pretty accessible for this climber. Open, it's not steep. It's, good. You have a lot of space to work with. And climber considerations are important because the climber will assess that too. So if you already preemptively assess that it's not going to be feasible, it saves a lot of time and money. It's okay to ask the climber too, like, what do you think about this? Because they have varying abilities and comfort levels. So if you want to show them, hey, this is what I'm looking at, or can you do it? They might say yes, they might say no. And in that vein, also keep some backup trees, because you just don't know if that climber is going to say, no, I'm not going to climb that tree. You have backup trees, marked, which, maybe they'll climb those. So have a good variety of trees that they can climb. And these are other climber considerations that Olivia touched up on. And so how easy will it be to get into the tree? Looking for the trees. This may or may not be helpful to the climber. It's all dependent on the climber. And I personally have not climbed a tree, so I defer to Olivia's presentation, at least not the way she was climbing trees. So if you have further questions, I think she would be the more appropriate person to ask. These are all considerations that we've taken into account asking climbers at the end of a season. We'll always ask, like, what can we do to improve? What are things we should look out for, since they are the ones climbing? Tree selection. So the seed trees we're looking for, dominant, co-dominant of cone-bearing age, a minimum of 12 inches of DBH, and a good phenotype. And I believe there's a handout on the different ages of cone-bearing age. And if not, if you Google woody plant seed manual, if you Google it, it's the whole PDF of all the woody trees, and there's the pine section, and that's where those handouts are from. You can download it. So you want to avoid diseased trees, forked trees, and low seed count trees. And you'll be able to tell by the low seed count trees by the cone cutting test that I'll be talking about later. Cone observations. So look at only the part of the crown expected to bear acceptable cones, usually the 2/3 to the top third of the trees. We want clusters in pines. Like this bottom photo is nice. It's got a lot of cones, and ideally we'd monitor that throughout the season. For red fir and white fir, you'll see like candles, but they're kind of sticking up straight in the top of the crown. And for other species, you'll see that the branches will sag from the cone weight as they still retain all that moisture. And I'll have pictures that better illustrate what I'm talking about. So a big question that we have on our cone crop survey is, what is none? Like, what's few versus many cones? Like the none, light, medium, heavy rating. And this is all relative. And each year that you do this, you'll have another slide show, whatever those are called, in your slideshow, picture for your slideshow of what is heavy and none or low. Few versus many. Emphasis on the many. So here we have incense cedar, and this is kind of what a good, ripe, acceptable collection for incense cedar will be. And you kind of see that they kind of are hanging down. You can see the needles are drooping, and you can see a climber up there. They have these cone rakes, and they kind of just brush the needles, and they collect all the cones into buckets, and they'll lower them. You can put them in a bag. It's a good visual aid. And those should be in handouts as well. Here's another one. So you can, it's kind of, these are old photos, and I've been trying to collect newer photos, more zoomed in photos through my binoculars over the past few years. So it's a little hard to see, but you can kind of see, like you see the vertical candles or white fir cones sticking up in the upper part of the whorls of the tree. So I would say this is kind of like a medium. The picture on the left would say medium, but the closer you are with binoculars to see it, the more helpful it is. And that would be a good photo to capture too. There's another photo of like a star, which is like a bunch of cones on the branch. And you can see in that photo kind of the sugar pine hanging down from the ends of the branches. And that, oh gosh, this glare. That would be maybe a medium, light to medium crop. This next one, you can see a good example of heavy crop or medium heavy crop and one without. And you can see how the branches are drooping down. So it's a good comparison. There's another one of Doug fir where you see, and these are still too early to pick, but the goal of this comparison is many versus few. And just, it's like I said, it's through multiple trees, numerous trees, not just one tree. And I'll go over cone ripeness as well later. Another one, very loaded versus not so loaded. So you can tell quite obviously that there's a lot of cones on that one and not as much on that. So we would, likely collect this one right here, the one on the right. Another example of a light crop, and I'd say like a moderate crop or medium crop. Not that many cones up here, wouldn't really be enough for a bushel. And that one has a lot more, and we can collect from the 2/3 and up. Here, this is a little hard to see, but it's incense cedar, really drooping down from the weight, and working on getting better photos. Another one of a heavy redwood crop where they cut the branches down. And we've gotten lucky where sometimes private industry will let us know like when they're harvesting, and if they're open to us collecting on their land, we can go as they're cutting and collect the cones from those trees because we know where it's from. But the timing has to be right too. Timing and safety has to align for that to happen. And they don't necessarily cut when the cones are ripe. They cut on their schedule. So that has to align as well. But it has happened. So these I took through my binoculars of some good white fir cone and some sugar pine, and this would be a good rating. I know it's only like the tip of the tree, but let's say it extends down. That would be a good crop to collect if there was a stand of similar amounts. And here you can see scale flexing, or they're kind of drying out, they're opening up, and I'll go over that as well in the next slide. So for cone sampling, so after we get those surveys and we go through the ratings and we call up the unit foresters and we say, hey, I have a question about this rating you did. Can you describe it? When do you have time to take me out, or can we meet? And so what we do is we'll go there, and ideally we'll have a climber. They'll climb, they'll get just maybe like 6 cones out of 6 to 10 trees in that area, and we'll ideally can do the cut test there. Or if we're not able to go and the unit forester is not able to go, the climber can do it and then mail it to us, and we'll do the cut test at Davis and immediately give you a response of collectible, not collectible, please monitor. And so there are different ways to get the sample done. And this sample is actually done with brine. So we want to collect a representative sample for an on-site assessment or shipped to us. And we want to sample from various positions in the crown as cones may ripen at different times along the tree. And do not sample only roadside trees. They might be easier, but it's not representative.
Yes.
Yeah. Grandma Road. I think we're developing our standards for that, or redeveloping, since we're seeing more fragmentation, but I don't have an exact number for that, but I think in the survey, or in the cone crop survey memo, that might be spelled out. But I don't have the number off the top of my head. I might have it here in my notes. Let me see. Yeah, but an important thing to do with the samples is to label and to keep them in paper bags if you're shipping them, not plastic. Never store cones in plastic. Paper is good. Label which seed zone elevation. If there's a site name, that's helpful too. It helps us keep track. And the cone cutting test. So in the field or at LMRC with the cones, we'll cut it lengthwise and we'll kind of do a half cut seed fill. And there's different thresholds for different species. So ponderosa, sugar pine, we want to see at least 75, 80% of filled seed. And then even after the half cut, we'll cut 100 seeds also lengthwise, and that has to pass a certain threshold too for it to be collectible. But this 75, 80% fill doesn't necessarily apply to, let's say, like cypress or coast redwood, because those are really hard to evaluate and they have a really low germination rate, period, like in general, compared to ponderosa and sugar pine. So it's all variable, and we take each sample into consideration to kind of strategize how we're going to execute the collections. And we have a form too, which I'm not sure I included, but it's a cone cut form that Danny and I fill out. You're not, climbers aren't expected to fill it out, but what we do is we count the filled seed. We note any insect activity, any like anything unusual or exceptional about the cone, about the sample. And we kind of make comments about how ripe it is and maybe how long it'll be till we think it's going to be ripe. Just anything about the sample. Here's some examples of, I guess the contrast isn't translating that well. But you can see on this side, it's from immature, this is the most immature to the least immature. So immature to mature. That's a better way of saying that. And you can see everything's more uniform in color. And by the end of that photo, you can see more of the lines, the delineation of the cone scales and the seed coat. And also, I think this PowerPoint will be available, so you can adjust the contrast to really see, because it's not translating that well up there. Maybe that screen is better, actually. Here's another one. This is a good cut with good filled seed, but you can see on the end there's a little bit of insect damage. So like Olivia said, if you are collecting cones and you toss in a cone that has like a kink in it, you'll see it in other photos. Like that insect could ruin your whole bushel, your bushel bag. There's better photos of, you can see clearer. It's a low seed count, but you can see the ones that are good, like this one. This one's not so good. There's a gap in the seed. And that one's a decent cut. So as we cut them lengthwise, we'll also break them all and pick out the seeds. We're not just counting the seed viability of the ones that are already bisected. We like individually tweezer out seeds, 100 of them, and we cut each one and tally them. Here's a good a white fir cut. It's still too early, but you can see there's a lot of seed and a lot of filled seed and a lot of empty seed. And not every cone is going to be perfect. You're not, it'd be nice, but it's not going to happen. Here's a good comparison of a bad sugar pine cut and a good one. Kind of hard to see in that one, but the seeds are mostly filled, whereas this one, there's a lot of aborted seed and just not a lot of seed fill count. So it also helps when you're cone cutting, if you do cone cut in the field, like with the tools back there, that your blade is sharp, because that'll affect how clean the cut is as well. There is a poor seed quality. Cone's not looking too good. And at this point, you can kind of see the scales are drying out a little bit, and there's just not a lot of good seed. So this is a coast redwood cut, and it's a coast redwood. Redwoods are hard to evaluate cut wise because their seed distribution is a little different, but we still cut them. And same thing with incense cedar. Incense cedar, we don't cut lengthwise, we cut right across, and you can kind of see the four seeds and their pitch pockets. So we look for how pitchy it is, and if it's like that nice milky white color, that's how we evaluate incense cedar. I don't have a photo of that in this presentation. And so cone damage. So this is, it's gonna be pretty obvious usually if there's cone damage, and you'll see kind of instead of a straight cone, it's like kinked over where the insect burrowed in. And so problems with insect damage cones, whether or not there is still larvae in there, is that it's hard to extract the seeds and process the seeds. It gunks up our equipment, and if the cones are unlikely to open, we're still running that machinery taking the same amount of time for cones that aren't opening. It takes more time, and we're already, pretty short-staffed. And so even if the cones do open and some that seed comes out, there's a decrease in yield. Your seed per pound will be lower. It's just collect good cone is the point, and also collect mature cones because it's very similar. It's much harder to extract and process if the cones open at all. Sometimes they'll case harden after you've collected them, and that's it. You're kind of done. And we still have to pay the climbers for those bushels. They're not responsible to determine the ripeness. If we tell them climb this tree, they'll climb it, and the ripeness of that cone and whether or not that opens falls on the evaluator, not the climber. Decrease in germination rate, they're more susceptible to mold and disease. Decrease in vigor of seedlings. Like we do a germ test for every lot, and you can tell kind of the condition that those cones came in and their germ rate are correlated. And also the decrease in storage potential. So if you do still get seed out and it's a decent, like okay germ rate, they don't last in the freezer as long. And seeds already, like incense cedar, for example, or firs, they last maybe 5 or 6 years before the germination rate really starts decreasing very rapidly. For seeds like ponderosa pine and sugar pine, they can last for a long time. We have seed lots from like the 80s that are still in the 90 percentile germ rate because they were collected at a good time, and so they store well. So it's not just the short-term quality, it's for the long-term storage as well. And so for that seed cutting test I was talking about, where we cut 100 seeds for each sample, we look for certain things in like the embryo and the megagametophyte for it to be a good seed. So it says cut at least 30, but we want 100. If you're in the field and you're short on time and you want to hit up more spots, like 30 is okay. So this is a good comparison of a good embryo versus one that's pretty shriveled and likely not going to germinate. You can see like a good separation, like that line, kind of hard to tethered. But you can kind of see like maybe where the cotyledons are going to form, and you can see kind of the milkiness, and it's opaque. And this one is very obvious that there's an empty cavity that the seed is not going to germinate. For every sample that we want, we cut 100. But if you're in the field and you're short on time, just try to cut as many as you can. Does that answer your question? And so this is a picture of a ponderosa pine that is good for collection. This is kind of the sweet spot you want. It's browning. It's not fully open for the seeds to blow out. So timing is really, really important. I've literally driven up to an incense cedar collection, supposed to be an incense cedar collection after this heat wave, and I saw the seeds flying away, and that was rough. So timing is very important. And so common indicators of ripeness, changes in size, color, and texture, because it varies with moisture content. So if you're continuously sampling and you get a cone and it feels a lot lighter than maybe what you sampled 2 weeks ago, it's because it's drying out. So that moisture isn't there, the weight isn't there. And keep in mind that cone color is useful, but it's subjective and variable, and it's not 100% accurate. And here, this is a progression of what we want to collect in terms of giant sequoia. These are too early. This is about the time we'd collect. That's spent cones, and those are like really old spent cones. We don't want that. So this is a nice progression. Did I skip one? No. Okay, so ripeness indicators. And this is hard to convey verbally, and I don't have samples because the seeds aren't ripe yet. And also the seeds I do have, they're all de-winged, so I can't show you a wing anyway. But here, for the seed wing, it darkens and separates easily from the cone scale, and it just feels kind of papery. And even if you just kind of slightly bend the scale a little bit, that wing can just pop off, and that's a really good indication. The embryo, if you're cutting the seeds, has that white opaque, yellow color, with 90% of that embryo elongated, and the megagametophyte has that white color, and it's a bit firmer. So here you have good examples of a ripe seed wing, and this one on the end is almost there, but it's how it looks like in the bract of the cone. So as it gets close to ripeness, not observing the cone isn't, it's helpful, but it's better to look at the seed as well, because it's the seed that you want, that's you want to be mature. And so here's just more examples of things that aren't quite ripe yet, like the larger photo to the left. And these are good seeds. You can see like a distinct difference between the embryo and the megagametophyte. And here the seed wing is, this is a bit immature. The seed wing kind of rips really easily. It's still a bit reddish in this fur. So a lot of indicators, like a lot of things have to align for it to be a mature seed. Okay. And here is the progression of immature to mature seed wing. And you can really see the difference. Like these wouldn't really separate from the scale that easily. And then at the end, you can kind of see a color difference. It's browner. You can kind of see a shadow that it's dried a little bit. It's kind of flaking up from the surface it's on. So this is a ripe seed, I'd say, based off of seed wing. And you can cut it as well to get an accurate assessment. Here's another one where you can kind of see that parchment you can kind of feel the texture. And also a good way is when you're holding that seed, if it's out, if the seed wing separates very easily, that's a very good sign too. If you've got to kind of tug on it or it's just not coming out, it might not be as ripe as it can be yet for collection, because when we process these cones, it goes through a dewinger, and it's this mesh cylinder. So if it's not ripe, the wings will catch in the mesh, but it won't break off. But when it's ripe, you can just kind of touch it and it breaks off. So that's part of the why ripe, mature cone and seed is imperative for the processing, because you lose a lot of seed when it's not. So when we determine that like conditions are good, it meets the criteria for during the cone sampling process for it to be a collectible crop, we'll call the unit forester and say, hey, we want to do a collection. This is when we think that the cones will be ready. If we need access, if it's on private property, we'll have that arranged if the forester cannot be there. And so part of the cone collection process is, I'm going to stress again that timing is very important. It's species, seed zone, and elevation dependent. And we really want the regular monitoring and cone cuts for assessment. Because oftentimes we kind of have to go in semi-blind and say, okay, like based off of weather, we think this is when it's going to be ripe. And we want to just have more information to make a more accurate decision. And again, too early, not good. And we want mature seeds, and we want to collect before the seed naturally flies away, but not too early. So this is very immature seed that was collected and it never opened. And that was just wasted time and energy and money, and we had to toss it. So that's a comparison of immature. Those aren't going to separate from the scale very well, and that's immature seed. And you have to monitor the weather too. You got to look maybe a week, 2 weeks in advance, and even then the weather isn't totally reliable. Yeah. Isn't totally reliable. So as it gets closer, weather forecasts change. You just kind of have to be on your toes all the time throughout the whole summer. Yeah. That could depend. It could be a couple days, really. Like I've had calls at 3 a.m. from a climber going like, I just got back to cell service. We think the weather's going to do this, and you just kind of have to get up and meet them and go. Like it's, especially without continuous monitoring, like the sampling, it gets a lot riskier to base it off of weather. So it does vary. And sometimes I'll collect in like Lassen or something and get a call, or no, down south, and then have to be in like Lassen the next few days to catch another crop or something. So it's kind of a whirlwind in the summer. It goes by really fast. And for each collection that we decide we're going to do, you're going to get, we provide a form called the FM44, and this is kind of the on-site collection data. And it essentially, the most important part is that it gives that unique lot number, that red number on the side. It's their unique identification. It's what it's going to go into our seed bank inventory as, and it has all the information about that collection. Any remarks, how many bushels at the date, just it's self-explanatory through the blanks. And part of the collection considerations is that if you can't, you need to mark the trees ahead of time. You should not be asking the climbers to choose the tree. The tree should be identified. They're there for you to point at a tree and go, climb that tree, then climb that tree. There should be zero downtime, because for them, like Olivia said, time is money and bushels is money. So they want as many bushels as possible. When you don't have the trees prepared and you're driving around looking for trees, that's not a good situation. The goal is to have these climbers back the next year. And if they know you're not going to be prepared, they're unlikely going to take your contract. or accept your contract. And so having collectible trees and even backup trees too, in case something happens and that tree is not available anymore. And when you climb those trees and you start putting it in the bushels, and our bags, like in the bag, we have a fill line. You'll put them in the bucket first, and then you'll dump them into the green bags. And it's really important that you don't go above the fill line because you need the rest of the bag for expansion as they dry out. And also it's important when you tag the bags, we have tags in the back in the example. There's 2 per bag. You put 1 inside and you zip tie 1 on the outside, and you use Sharpie. And it's really important you don't tie them like the left side because there's no room for the cones to expand. That left, yeah, this side. This one, don't do that. This is better. And when you're looking at the bags, it's really like if you just put 2 fists, it's right under there. That's a sweet spot for the zip tie. Put the tag on so that if that one rips off, we know on the inside that there's information in there. So not that one. And we will provide the bags, zip ties, and tags to the climber or whoever wants to pick them up. This is an example of the label. So 1 tag inside and 1 tag outside. And the lot number is the one, that red portion on the FM44. And we'll let you know that as well. It's a lot, but I've kind of touched on these before, and so has Olivia, that collection considerations. So seeds with like pitch pockets without like incense cedar, they'll pitch out really easily. Or fir, they're delicate because when you want to collect red fir or white fir, they're kind of catching it, like when you touch it at the top of the tree, it's crumbling away. That's when you want it. So when you're collecting ones that when you grab it, it doesn't move, that's too early. So timing of white fir and red fir and the collection is a bit tricky because you want to get them in the bushel, but you don't want to crumble them where you're losing all that seed. So those seeds without that hard seed coat, they're more delicate. And you want ventilation, airflow. So if you're putting down seeds and you have all the bushels by your truck, you want to store them kind of in the shade and off the ground if possible. If you're storing it in a truck and transporting it and you have to stay overnight, if it has a shell on it and there's no ventilation, we don't want that either. So usually me or Danielle will drive to the site and just get them back to LMRC as possible. We have cone racks where we lay down all the bushels and there's good airflow. It's outdoors, it's covered. And, you know, tying it is important, or the location of the zip tie. Don't cover it with plastic. Want to protect them from any pests. They want to transport to the facility as soon as possible. And this is also really important, is we want to minimize the amount of trash in the bags. I have a picture here. This is trash. We don't want these needles. We don't want excess pine material, or especially an incense cedar. When they're raking it, they'll rake out a lot of those needles. And as those needles dry with the cones, they get brittle and they're pokey. And when you're processing the seeds, they can puncture those vesicles very easily. And then you can lose like all that seed that you've just processed, the cone and the seed, because of this dry material. So it's very labor intensive because no ground crew wants to sit there and like pick off each incense cedar cone, or like for coast redwood, cutting off the peduncles, because those will dry out and also damage seed. So, and this takes up a lot of Dania and mine's time and whatever crew we have in processing. We hand clean, so if there's a really dirty lot, we have crews that come in, or me, Dania, and whoever's available. We sit around a table and we go through each seed to take out all the trash, because if we stored it with the trash, it's not going to store well. So it's very labor intensive and it takes up a lot of time. So bottlenecks that we have that we're trying to mitigate is climber availability and our climber contracting pool. continuous sampling because cone season is during fire season. And it's very difficult to get available people who aren't responding to fires, or place you want to collect is too close to a fire. And we will not ask anyone to climb that. And if I think last year or 2 years ago, there was a climbing crew that we had to ask to come down because you could see smoke, and it's just, you know, you never know, and it's safety first, always. The collection timing, weather dependent, location, and who's available to go. If there's no one to pick up the cones and they're just sitting there, that's not ideal either. So those are, like, everything has to come together for it to be a very good collection. And so here I'll talk about the CAL FIRE contract specifications. If you do want to climb for CAL FIRE, is that when we have a sample or collection that we want, we have a roster of climbers who were interested, and we'll kind of send out an email blast saying, this is what we want, this is the location, respond within the next 24 hours, 48 hours, and we have to go with the lowest bid. And if we choose the lowest bid, we contact you and you're not available, we move on. And so, and the lowest bid is a state policy. So we move on, and then your bid price should be kind of a sum of all your expenses. It's not, this is what I want for driving or my food. It's included in that bid. So for sampling, we see it as a service, and the paperwork should be a handout. If not, we can email it. It's so that we can get you into our payment system and so that you can get paid. And each sampling site requires its own invoice. And this is also in the printout, the specifications of what to do. So it's not just on this PowerPoint. And we require that the climbers have their own insurance. So the difference between a cone sampling and a collection is that the collection, we're paying you by the good because it is a higher price. With how we pay contractors, this will be considered a good, and it's your price per bushel, which is the same where everything is baked into that price. The same it's the same process of when we identify a site, we'll send you an email, and whoever responds by that end date, we'll start to go through those people. And here's just a list of partnerships we've been fostering with the Forest Service, Resource Conservation Districts, BLM, the Triple Cs, and we have a lot of great landowners who call every year and say, like, this is what I see on my land, would you come out and take a look? And we have collected on private landowner land. And we also have a good relationship with private industry. I mean, they look out for themselves, of course, first, but if they have excess bushels or they have an area of land where they know they're not going to finish collecting, they don't need that much, they'll give us a call and we can go out there, and oftentimes we'll ask the unit forester to contact that private industry forester and just be a representative there for the collection. And here's a list of my references, a woody seed plant manual. So if you just Google that and type in USDA, you'll get like a thick PDF of everything you ever want to know about seeds. And I can leave this up for a little bit, but here's my and Dania's contact information. Our cards are also in the back, and you're welcome to come tour the facility. Just give me or Dania an email, and we can make that happen.
I do want to mention that although we have all those cards, isn't not for the entire that you know of, or interest. Please let us know. Just our network also just to have more.
Any questions? Okay, time's up.
How's everyone doing? We're a little ahead of time. Do we need a break maybe? No, we're good? Okay. All right.
You're writing on me at this point.
I'll make sure you're able to get on.
Is it this one?
Should be the second recording.
There it goes. I did it. Under pressure. All right, afternoon, everyone. I am Wade Bell, and I am the forester for the Region 5 Genetic Resource Program. And I'm going to go over the survey tool that we use for cone collection on the U.S. Forest Service side. I'm going to sit while I do this one because I'm going to do it interactively while online. All right. So we use ArcGIS's Survey 123. This is something that you would need to use also an Esri account. For those of you that don't have one and want to use Survey 123, we are able to get an account set up with the U.S. Forest Service as a guest account to use it. And to get one of those, if interested, we'll contact Arnaldo Ferreira and he can help set it up. I think you're still the one to contact for that. All right, it's him. So when I'm going to do this online, but the app version looks identical. So when you open up Survey 123, there's hundreds of surveys available. It's very easy. Just bring up and type into the search function here. Is my mouse? Oh, it is moving. A little lag. Seed. And the first one that comes up is the Forest Genetics Cone Crop Survey. And that will be the one we are using. And it'll bring up the app. And like I said, this looks identical on the computer as it does on the app. So as you can see, make sure your location is turned on when you're doing this one. And it should bring up, as you can see, it shows that we are here in Delray. It does give the latitude, longitude right off the bat. So when collecting, like it's been stated several times before, CAL FIRE doesn't do single tree. U.S. Forest Service does do single tree. This app only counts by species, not necessarily by tree itself. So when doing a stand, you would want to take averages of the stand. And then with single tree, obviously you just use it as a single tree. So once you have your coordinates and you're in, you can pick your thing. The hot button topic today is Ponderosa. We'll stick with it. You'll see below, after you picked your species, amount of seed crop. So this is, again, we're going to do this on average for a stand. The general rule of thumb is, 1 star would be less than or equal to 2 bushels. And we come up with that because that's generally within the Forest Service contract. Is most contractors don't climb a tree for anything less than 2 bushels. 2 stars would be 3 to 10 bushels. 3 stars would be 10 or greater. However, we do realize that that is, kind of subjective to your area, depending on what your seed need is and all that kind of stuff. If it's, low elevation ponderosa pine and it's a few stand, it has 3 bushels, you might want to say that that's 3 stars because that's, for you to, go back to later going, hey, that's high need. We want to collect it, anything that catches your thing. So that's subjective for you, depending on your seed need. But that's the general rule of thumb: 1 star, less than or equal to 2 bushels, 2 to 3 to 10, 3 stars, greater than 10 bushels. Access to tree or to seed collection with the little thumbs up. So 1 star, and then keep in mind, this has been talked about a few times, but these are where you're going to keep in, how, are the roads narrow? Is access limited? is there a place to park, more than one car? It's been my experience, and I think, most anybody else, when you're bringing in contractors, a lot of them are, each climber has the ground person, but each climber has their own vehicle. So if you're bringing in 3 or 4 or 5, climbing teams, you got to keep that into, consideration. Are you going to be able to safely park, 5 cars along the side of the road? The same thing in there, is this area, is it steep banks? Are you gonna be hoofing it, right as soon as you get off the road, straight downhill or uphill? Are you sitting on a blind corner? Are you gonna have to allocate somebody from a ground crew if you're collecting from here, acting as a flagger to stop vehicles while they're doing this kind of stuff? And you also want to use it for, what's your understory look like? Are you dropping a bunch of stuff into, uh, poison oak or anything like that? So 1 star would be, something similar to, thick, so narrow roads, limited parking, steep banks, poor visibility around corners, thick underbrush, on the collection site. 2 stars, obviously, you're able to park safely. I'll go with.
We could be able to use this offline as well.
Yes, so I was going to come to that one. So this one you can use as long as your GPS will work offline. This you are able to collect offline. When you are back online is when it'll actually submit. So it'll just sit there and it'll tell you that it's waiting to submit the data, but you don't actually have to go back through and remember and submit it later. Once you're back online, it'll automatically submit the data.
So we don't have to be online to get through to 123 survey to this app.
No, you can get through. You can get onto the survey 123 offline. Yeah, it's a nice feature for this one, and one of the reasons why we used it. Oh yes, and then the access again. The 2 stars, mostly flat terrain at the collection site, little to no underbrush. 3 stars, I should say 3 thumbs up. Uh, it's there's a large pull-off area. It's relatively flat terrain. You're on a straight road with a lot of visibility, little to no underbrush during the collection site. Location, these are brought in. These are all on national forest for the most part until you get into towards the bottom, and you will see we do have a few national parks put in here. Private landowner, if we're not working in collaboration, or even if we are working in collaboration with CAL FIRE, private landowner, other public lands, BLM, if you're collecting on tribal lands, anything like that. And then another category for something that we can't foresee. The local area is really the only area within this app where you actually do any typing. So one of the reasons we use this is, so you're in, where are we at? Close to, Stanislaus National Forest or Sequoia. We're closer to Sequoia in this area, I think. Sequoia, you're off, road X or whatever. This is a good area where you can kind of put, your local area more site specific. One of the things to keep in mind is during collections, if this is going to be one of the areas, I try to be consistent. So as you can see with the cone tags for the U.S. Forest Service, it'll have kind of the local area that you handwrite on the tag. I try really hard to make sure that whatever I'm surveying, and that's what I've named the local area, if I'm collecting, I've also, just keeping yourselves, organized. The other thing that I use for the local area is if you need to make any kind of notes, side notes on anything, what road you're off of or anything, is a good area to also type that in. Like I said, it's the only place we can. Next after below that is the seed zone. I know it's been brought up and I'm going to say it again. There's a lot of repetitive and repetition here, but a lot of forests, or several forests, especially up north and some down south, have multiple seed zones. So just be very mindful if you are actually working near any one of those boundaries that you're just keeping track of, what seed zone you're on. Elevation, the Placerville Nursery runs in 500-foot elevation bands. We also keep these in 500-foot elevation bands as well. And then a picture. So easy enough, if you're doing a single tree, rust-resistant sugar pine, take a picture. For whatever reason, it only allows us to take one picture of it. So if you're doing a stand, I would take a picture of one of the better trees or any, defined landmarks on that one, and then maybe just take pictures, on your phone of individual trees. And we've talked about, I know Olivia and Jessica both just talked about, flagging. You might want to just flag and take pictures of the specific trees and just keep them um, uh, on hand for when you're collecting. And then, of course, the survey year. We're in 2022, in case anybody forgot already. This thing doesn't. And that's basically it for this survey collection. It is very simple. We did that on purpose. When you're out surveying, you want to get as many done as you can. So this is the bare bones, what we need to be successful with this one. I have used, during monitoring, I will take and use this, and then just making sure when I'm back monitoring, if anything's changed. There could, it could have looked like a great cone crop, your first couple times in monitoring, and you're not touching the survey again, but all of a sudden, half your stand aborted. You can go back through, click on the survey that you've already used, and make adjustments there, and it'll adjust in the on the backside as well. So that's the reason why, again, that it is very simple to use. Go right ahead.
Once you submit these, does it create like a list for you of all the submittals that you've already put in? Or?
That's a very good question. That's where I was getting ready to head to on this one. So besides, just taking this, and besides using this for, this year's, oh good, it's working. Um, besides taking this and using it as data for your collections this year, we also use this information moving forward too. Let's see, get in here. So that does take averages through all the collections, but it does, we can tell, how many records, were collected in a year, how many participants, when somebody first started, go back up. When somebody first started, when it was last done. I thought my computer froze up for a second there. But, and we can see, again, averages throughout the region, what the average, cone crop looked like throughout the region, what was the average, what are the road conditions like where we're going on average? Who was the, which forest or person, spent the most time in the woods doing the surveys and monitoring and stuff like that. The other stuff we use on this for the data, again, besides for just this year's collection, is we look at the representation. We ask ourselves, is the forest getting a full genetic representation? With this we can pinpoint, wrong one, we can monitor, with each forest, are you moving away from a different watershed? Are you switching elevations? What's your slope and aspect, and all that kind of stuff. And the purpose of this information that we use on that one is for making the nursery's future seed bank inventory more geographically accurate to each forest's specific needs. And what I mean by that is less lumped seed lots. So in the past, I'm going to use the El Dorado since that's where I'm from. So seed zone 526, if you collected at, let's say we're going to use Ponderosa, and you did 3 stands, similar in the same area, at 5,000 feet, those all got lumped into one lot. Now with this, using this information, we can actually break them up, and by looking at and going, oh well, there might be right next to each other, or quarter of a mile away, but this one's actually on a different slope, or it's on a different watershed, and we'll keep them more, like I said, geographically specific. And that is all I have on this, other than pitching. Oh, Arnaldo. Which one? Yep.
Right there at the top, you see map. It's showing, you gotta zoom in.
Zoom in.
It's a good idea of dispersion.
Yes. We'll go further here. Yeah, here's, and again, we can use these, this information, knowing where we collected from. Like Arnold pointed out, now you can actually get a visual representation of where things were collected last year. But, it's pretty good overall for the state, considering 7 people used it last year. Arnaldo was busy. But that's what I have for the survey tool. Are there any questions, any clarifications on anything?
We use this app, it gets submitted to you.
Yes, it'll get put into this. Actually, what you're seeing right here is what we see on the back end of it.
So how do we test the information again for ourselves to be able to send to us?
You should be able to grab it right from this. If you have the Esri account, you can go online like I am and you have access to this information. Nothing hidden. Any other?
I'm already inputting observations into field maps. Sierra, Stanislaus, and Yosemite. I have a way to reach into LA Moran and get that, so I'm not going out to different databases.
We were working, I know you pitched a few times, we're working on putting a combined one together. I would probably have reached out to Jessica going, hey, do you have any information?
Blank, and I know I put a lot of sites.
Because the database are
Right.
So, but, we're gonna try to sync them. We actually were talking about that.
So basically what would happen is we'd send the data to Arnaldo, but it wouldn't necessarily be on theirs right now.
Because we did collect on the Sierra.
Yeah, that would be great also if, with that cost we have. For now, you can have access. But with that, but we're gonna try to get all these data together in one map for everybody to use.
And it might be, I'm assuming it'll probably still be Esri, but it might, different platform. It might not be 1, 2, 3, or you use a different one as well.
I think they're migrating everything.
The field maps. One other thing that we were also going to use this for, besides in collaboration with CAL FIRE, is during collections. I know Olivia talked about the cone handling checklist. So in the works is to be able to take the data that you've taken. Final stretch, 2 more things to talk about. And we're leading off with the last stretch with contracts. So there we go. Here in a minute. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the blanket purchase agreement for the U.S. Forest Service. Keep in mind, for those of you with the national parks and BLM, this is still relevant, and to CAL FIRE through an agreement, which we will talk about after this one. So a quick background. The blanket purchase agreement was implemented for the first time last year. It was put together in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service Central Contracting Group, the Genetic Resource Program, and with other collaboration with other forest and people like Olivia, who this wouldn't happen without trial and error from many years of her doing this. So real quick, so the goal of this BPA was to help standardize cone collection efforts throughout Region 5, while still giving each forest collection some personalization for their needs. And so what that means is, especially for the Forest Service and anybody interested in working with the BPA, the best way to think about this agreement is this is a catalog. So I handed out for everybody to share at least one per area. So the very first page on there is kind of the catalog overview of what is listed within the BPA. And before I go too much further, I have a list of abbreviations since we are the government and everything is abbreviation. BPA, the blanket purchase agreement. CO is a contracting officer. COR is the representative. GPC is the government purchase card holder. More specifically, I said government purchase card holder. Section B is the vendor or price list breakdown. And I think we have one vendor. Hi, Jamie. So that would be for you, which is the UEI, which is the unique identity information, which you already have. So I'm going to start off with for orders or calls to this catalog or BPA under 2,500. This is something that contracting is pushing for all foresters and silviculturists to use this year. This does not require anybody to put a requisition in and to go through all those hoops with contracting and budget. The nice thing is with this is if you use your purchase card, which everybody from the Forest Service and I'm sure BLM and national parks are very similar with a cutoff for services at 2,500. Doing any more than that, even if it's split up, you run into a split purchase and they red flag you and they get mad at you. If you use a preferred vendor or use a vendor from the list that we already have, you can, as long as you make it, you make them specific enough and separate them, you can use your government purchase card for more than one purchase without running the risk of that being flagged as a split purchase. I'm saying that I would always contact whoever your local CO is that you're working with, call to make sure that they are aware of that as well so they can go to bat for you when that happens. For calls over 2,500, it's going to be the same as any other requisition or contract you're putting together. You will do your requisition checklist, your section B. The nice thing is what makes this BPA very not user friendly is because this already has firm fixed, or I should say fixed, not firm fixed pricing on this one. Is you're already going to have your vendor pricing beforehand. So the only thing that really might change will be their mileage. So if you're picking 3 vendors that you want to fly competitively for them to compete against, the only thing that might change on that would be their mileage and stuff like that. But that's for them to decide on that one. But so with that being done, your market research is already done for you and ready to go. So that's one of the nice things that helps expedite the process, as it has been said more than once that once your surveys are done and you're ready to go to contracting and collect, it's really fast turnaround. So that was the goal of this, was to make sure that this was you can get this through and implemented and get back into the field with your collectors as soon as possible. The other thing is, if you look in your packet later, it already has most of the nitty gritty, your major scope of works, your technical requirements, all your definitions, and so on and so forth for that, where it's nice and it gets personalized when you send in your requisition packets, and on your checklist, you can put in your own section C, your scope of work, for anything that you feel like the BPA is missing or you need that's more specific for your collection area, where it gives in, and those can be added in. So it's, the monotony and the definitions and all it already covers all the major stuff that you would already put into your packet. The only other thing you would need to put in that's not in here is any of your, like I said, your included maps, any special requirements, your district or your forest fire plans, and then your COR nomination and their certificate. I am the COR for the blanket purchase agreement, which means I can do the requisitions and I talk to the COs, stuff like that. But for those of you who are COR certified, it is still up to you to put together and be the COR and have your technical people on the ground with that one. Contracting's not letting, they're not letting me run the whole region, and I'm okay with that one. So one of the other things I wanted to show on this real quick is just kind of how we break down the section B. Let's see if I can take the microphone and not rip it off the computer here. So I'm showing you one here, and it's kind of an example of if you're running something that's going to be more than 2,500 and you were been asked to be the COR on multiple forests. So how it kind of breaks down each line item. So line item 8 was just needle collection. Most of that's done for the genetics program, but you can see it's area 1, Sequoia, Sierra, Stanislaus, Inyo. So we break them down by forest under each line item. So it does get a little repetitive, but that's kind of an example of how multiple forests are done. It can be translated into multiple districts if you're keeping it smaller, but you have more, then you can actually justify doing a micro purchase with. Uh, but that's just an example of that one. This is our vendor list and what their BPA number looks like. That's very small. That's one of the things we're working on is getting more vendors in here. Oops. And so that's, yes, definitely something we need to work on. We are working on currently. One of the reasons we're having these meetings is, you know, everybody here probably knows somebody that might be interested, arborist, you know, climbers that just like to climb for fun, that like trees. We can get them in. They just got to be certified. They have to be certified for the Forest Service. And I believe CAL FIRE, they don't need to be certified. Forest Service, they need to be certified climbers.
CAL FIRE only requires that you have full liability insurance.
Okay. The other thing to point out is the BPA number. So if I go back to this one where at the top where it says the BPA number, that 127 multiple things, when you are flying, you have a specific vendor in mind and they are available, you would use their number when you put it on the call. What also makes the BPA a little bit nicer is because you already have their pricing, you can call a vendor ahead of time and go, hey, I have these cone collections. They're going to be ready in a week. Are you available? If they are, great. You put them in, send it through. Contracting takes care of any negotiations, and then you're ready to go. You also have the availability to fly competitively, like I said earlier. In that case, you wouldn't put a assigned BPA number to any one person or 3 of them and make 3 different schedules. You don't need to do that. Make one schedule, take an average of your prices, just put in the BPA section where the BPA number would go, that you're just the Region 5 cone collection, and contracting will know that you're flying it competitively. Let's see, where else am I at? Okay, so that is kind of the end and nitty gritty of the contract side of it. Are there any questions before I move on? And well, this might be just pertinent for you.
They open up for more vendors.
Yes. Contracting is going to be opening up for more vendors to put in. It is, let me check my notes. The date is not is not set yet, but the packet is going to try to go out July, mid-June, early July to go out. So keep an eye. So again, anybody who that you know is interested and they either are registered or need to register, have them do it now. And I'm going to skip because there's not a lot of, Jamie's already gone through all this. Okay, so I will go. Oh, it's a little PTSD going through government websites here for this one. Uh, so when you reach out to your vendors, that if you have any that you want to know, I know you were interested possibly, it would not come through the Conservation Corps. It would be if you decided to do this. All right, so once you're registered and you get your UEI, if your vendors are looking, you would want to go to the contract opportunities portion of sam.gov. And then you would want to search cone collection. I looked really hard through this to do cone collection, but since they haven't opened it up, there's nothing there. So my example was going to be, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's okay. I'm going to skip through. So my example for this was herbicide. You know, not even close, but that's okay. But this is a good way to show, and I will have this presentation available to everybody else. So if you have that vendor you're looking at, please send it to them. It has really good information on there about the status and how to go through, but, you know, looking for active contracts, you know, even subcontracting and stuff like that. Make sure they're aware that their links and how they submit are all in the attachment and links portion of the sam.gov or the contract opportunities. And point of contact. So each zone will have its own, you know, CO attached to the thing. So I might, if I put in 2 calls to the BPA for Central, that doesn't mean it's going to be the same CO that's flying the solicitation. So so a vendor also needs to be aware of that and check who is the CO for contact on that one. The other thing I'd point out again, that the BPA packet is going out for bid mid-June, early July. Vendors need to check the website regularly. Don't rely on emails from any of us because we all send tons of them anyway, and that's easily missed. And then finally, contact information. Sarah Hill from Central Contracting is the BPA contracting specialist. I am the COR for the BPA. For those of you that are interested in ordering, for right now, the BPA documents and the ordering guide for everybody is attached to this hyperlink. Again, I will send out non-Forest Service personnel. You'll have to work through Forest Service to get onto it because it is on their private secured network. Vendors, Jamie, I'm singling you out, sorry. SAM.gov for registering, which you've already done. And then there is a YouTube video to show potential vendors on how to register and get the unique ID. And are there any questions before we jump right into the last portion of it? All right. Yes.
Just if anybody knows a local arborist, a small group that might be interested in trying, collection. We have, like Wade said, it's small purchase orders, right? That they can try out. It's a small thing. We can, have the people around to show specifics of tree climbing, not specifics of tree climbing, specifics of home collecting. So they're already tree climbers. And just to motivate them to look for us.
Have you tried to reach out to Columbia College in Sonora? Because I know Tom Hoffer has really opened up the programs there, and they're constantly looking for that kind of stuff to teach the students there. So that might be a good avenue to get these younger folks to get into that, and might bring in a whole new set of people.
That's a very good.
That's a great.
They just started learning how to tag into trees recently for felling trees, climbing them and felling them. So they've just started doing that 2 years ago. So I would imagine, cone collection probably fits right in there too. And he might even start a class doing it.
Are you in contact with them already?
Yeah, I've been I can get in contact with Tom Hofstra. I'll even give you his number.
That would be great. Yeah.
I have no problems with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. That's it. That was it. We got one more to go. We're light at the end of the tunnel here. So I know it's been mentioned by Olivia and Dania and probably Jessica as well a few times, but for the partnerships, we've talked about the agreement. So the purpose of and this one I'm talking specifically between CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service. I know I spoke to the National Park Service, and there either is one or there is going to be an agreement in place that'll probably be probably identical for this portion of it this year, hopefully. I do know that there is one that's identical to this for the BLM. So that's when I said that the contracting stuff is relevant for your agencies. This is why, because it goes through the partnership. That being said, so the purpose for the collaborative effort between the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE to collect seeds on private and public lands. It was put together to help expand CAL FIRE's collection areas, and it also fills the collection gaps between both agencies. So how it works, and I'm going to read right off the PowerPoint, sorry. CAL FIRE, if they are looking at Forest Service land, will need to coordinate with the local forester or district ranger on where they intend to survey and collect. On the agreement on the U.S. Forest Service side of it, the personnel from the Forest Service can help by providing, any additional reconnaissance, survey notes, as well as any restricted areas due to like active timber sales, archaeological sites, etc. CAL FIRE in this instance is responsible for providing their own climbers if it's individually done, as well as their own ground personnel. If the Forest Service deems that the seed they're collecting is needed, They have the ability to receive 25% of the collected seed. With that being said, anybody on, and this would go for, again, BLM, national parks, CAL FIRE that's collecting on Forest Service land needs to keep a copy of the agreement with them at all times. And Arnaldo, myself, and Gary Klein, who is the Placerville nursery manager, can provide a copy of the agreement. Yep. And then we are going to hammer on again. We've talked about it. Communication is key. It is important for any agency collecting on National Forest Service land, not Forest Service personnel, to communicate with the local Forest Service district ranger or forester. The agreement is regional, but coordination is at the district level. And then we want to avoid any potential double ups. And what I mean by double ups is we don't want to see CAL FIRE, you know, with a collection team adjacent to the National Forest Service land, and all of a sudden Forest Service brings in another collection team and you're half a mile away when that could have been put in on one, could have been put in on the BPA. Same thing goes with BLM, national parks. Matter of fact, I did one up on the Tahoe and BLM parcels last year, I believe, with Kareem. Was we did an agreement and we collected, you know, switched. We collected on BLM land, and then we'll eventually get around to, you know, giving 25% when we get that far into it. But again, we don't want to double up. And I think, oh, again, more contact info. And is there any questions on the agreement? All right, you guys made this really easy for me, and that's it. That's all I got.